Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, cutting through the static of Officer Patricia Wells' radio like a blade through silence. She'd been patrolling the back roads around Fort Morrison for 3 hours, fighting to stay awake with gas station coffee and the kind of country music that made her question her life choices. 7 years working the graveyard shift for the Forbidden Area Police Unit had taught her that most nights were exactly like this one: long, cold, and empty. But the voice crackling through her radio carried something she'd never heard before. A tremor that made her spine straighten and her hands tighten on the steering wheel. Unit 47, we need you at the north perimeter of Fort Morrison. We've got a situation. Patricia knew Fort Morrison better than her own backyard. The sprawling military installation sprawled across 2,400 acres of Colorado wilderness like a concrete cancer, abandoned since 1987 when the government claimed budget cuts had made it redundant. For 35 years, it had been slowly consumed by nature. Weeds pushing through cracked concrete, vines claiming the barracks, and snow settling into broken windows like cataracts in dead eyes. The place had once housed 15,000 personnel during the height of the Cold War, but now it served only as a monument to paranoia and a paycheck for the handful of security contractors who kept the curious away. "What kind of situation, dispatch?" Patricia asked, already turning her Crown Vic toward the old military road that led to the fort's main entrance. Trespasser called 911 from inside the facility. Male, approximately 25 years old. Says he's trapped underground, and the dispatcher's voice faltered. Says he found something he wasn't supposed to find. There it was. That phrase that made every Forbidden Area police officer's blood run cold. Patricia had heard variations of it dozens of times over the years, usually from urban explorers who'd stumbled across chemical storage areas or munitions dumps that the military had been less than thorough about cleaning up. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the way the dispatcher's voice had dropped to almost a whisper when repeating the trespasser's words. Or maybe it was the way the October wind had suddenly picked up, howling through her partially open window like something trying to get inside. Copy that, dispatch. ETA 15 minutes. Patricia pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb past the legal limit as she navigated the winding mountain road. The headlights of her cruiser carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating pine trees that pressed close to the asphalt like spectators at an execution. She'd driven this route hundreds of times, but tonight it felt longer, as if the road itself was reluctant to deliver her to her destination. The rusted gates of Fort Morrison appeared in her headlights like the entrance to a graveyard. They stood permanently open now, the chain-link fence topped with razor wire, more for show than actual security. The warning signs were still there, their reflective letters catching her headlights. Authorized personnel only. Deadly force authorized. U.S. government property. No trespassing. But the paint was peeling, the metal was rusted, and the threats they represented felt as hollow as the buildings they were meant to protect. Patricia's cruiser crunched over gravel as she passed through the main checkpoint, her headlights sweeping across the guard shack that had been empty for over 3 decades. The windows were broken, the door hung open on rusted hinges, and someone had spray-painted "Abandon Hope" across the side in letters that had faded from red to brown over the years. She'd always wondered if that had been the work of some philosophical vandal, or simply a former soldier's bitter goodbye. The main base spread out before her like a miniature city built for giants. The barracks stretched in perfect rows, their uniformity broken only by the occasional collapsed roof or wall that had finally surrendered to time and weather. The administrative buildings hunched against the skyline like sleeping beasts, their broken windows reflecting her headlights in fragments that looked disturbingly like eyes. And beyond it all, barely visible in the distance, loomed the restricted section, the part of Fort Morrison that had been off limits even when the base was fully operational. Patricia followed the main road deeper into the facility, her radio crackling with static that seemed to get worse the further she drove. This was normal for Fort Morrison. The place was a dead zone for most electronic communications, something to do with the geology of the area and all the metal infrastructure buried underground. But tonight, the static seemed more aggressive, more purposeful, as if something was actively trying to jam her communications. She tried raising dispatch to confirm her location but got only white noise in response. Standard protocol dictated that she should turn around and wait for backup when communications were compromised. But backup was 40 minutes away, and someone might be dying in the tunnels beneath her feet. Patricia had joined the Forbidden Area Police because she believed in helping people, even people stupid enough to break into abandoned military installations in the middle of the night. The road to the north perimeter was barely more than a dirt track, overgrown with weeds and marked by potholes that could swallow a small car. Patricia's Crown Vic bounced and lurched as she navigated around the worst of the obstacles, her headlights revealing glimpses of rusted equipment and concrete barriers that seemed to have been placed at random intervals. This part of the base had always given her the creeps, even during daylight visits. There was something about the way the shadows fell, the way sound seemed to echo strangely, the way her radio always started picking up signals that shouldn't have been there. The north perimeter was separated from the main base by a 12-foot chain-link fence, topped with enough razor wire to stop a determined rhinoceros. The gate should have been secured with multiple locks and alarm systems, but as Patricia's headlights swept across it, she saw that it was standing wide open. The chain that should have secured it lay on the ground in two pieces, the metal bright and fresh where it had been cut. Patricia stepped out of her cruiser, immediately noticing how much colder it was here than at the main entrance. The October wind carried the scent of pine and decay, underlaid with something else, something metallic and sharp that made her nose wrinkle and her eyes water. She approached the gate carefully, one hand resting on her service weapon, and examined the severed chain. The cuts were clean and recent, probably made within the last few hours by someone with professional-grade bolt cutters. Fresh tire tracks in the mud led through the gate and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Patricia knelt and examined them with her flashlight, noting that they belonged to a compact car, probably a Honda or Toyota. Urban explorers loved small, fuel-efficient vehicles that could navigate rough terrain without drawing too much attention. But these tracks were deep, suggesting the car had been heavily loaded, and there were footprints alongside them, multiple sets, which meant the trespasser hadn't come alone. Patricia keyed her radio again, hoping the shorter distance to the main gate might improve reception, but got only static that sounded almost like voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She got back in her cruiser and drove through the gate into the restricted section of Fort Morrison. The restricted area looked like the surface of an alien world. Most of the structures here were underground, marked only by concrete entrances set into hillsides like tomb openings. The few buildings that stood above ground were windowless concrete blocks that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Patricia had been briefed that this section contained old storage facilities and communications equipment. nothing dangerous enough to justify the extreme security measures. But as her headlights swept across warning signs in multiple languages and symbols she didn't recognize, she began to suspect that her briefings hadn't included the whole truth. The tire tracks led to a concrete structure that looked identical to all the others. A simple steel door set into a grassy hillside, surrounded by warning signs about authorized personnel and deadly force. But this door was standing open, and a thin beam of artificial light was spilling out into the darkness like blood from a wound. Patricia parked her cruiser and approached on foot, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and call for backup she knew wouldn't come for at least an hour. The steel door was heavier than it looked, designed to withstand forces that conventional doors would never encounter. The edges were lined with rubber seals that suggested this wasn't just an entrance but an airlock, meant to keep something in or keep something out. Patricia stepped across the threshold and found herself at the top of a concrete staircase that descended into the earth at a steep angle, disappearing beyond the reach of her flashlight. "Police! Anyone down here?" she called out, her voice echoing in the narrow stairwell and coming back to her changed, distorted by acoustics that didn't seem quite right. The staircase was longer than it should have been, descending much deeper than the surface topology would suggest was possible. Patricia counted steps as she went down, 50, 75, 100, until she lost count somewhere around 130. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, and the metallic smell she'd noticed outside grew stronger, accompanied by something else that made her think of hospitals and laboratories. Emergency lighting flickered to life as she descended, motion sensors activating systems that should have been dead for decades. The lights revealed walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits painted in the institutional green that had been standard for military construction in the 1960s. But mixed in with the conventional infrastructure were cables and connections that looked far more modern, as if someone had been upgrading the facility long after it was supposed to have been abandoned. The staircase ended at a heavy steel door marked with radiation symbols and warnings in English, Russian, and what looked like Chinese. The door was propped open with a chunk of concrete, and beyond it lay a corridor that stretched further than Patricia's flashlight could penetrate. The air that drifted out was warm and humid, carrying that hospital smell more strongly and something else. Something organic and wrong that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. Patricia followed the muddy footprints down the corridor, her boots echoing on polished concrete floors that showed no signs of the decay and neglect visible in the surface facilities. The walls here were lined with doors marked with symbols she didn't recognize, and many of them stood open to reveal rooms full of equipment that definitely hadn't been manufactured in the 1980s. Computer terminals with flat-screen monitors displayed data streams in languages that hurt to look at directly. Diagnostic equipment hummed quietly to itself, monitoring things that shouldn't have needed monitoring in an abandoned facility. The footprints continued straight down the main corridor, but Patricia found herself stopping to peer into the open rooms, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. One room contained rows of what looked like medical equipment, IV stands, monitoring devices, and examining tables, but everything was oversized, as if designed for patients much larger than normal humans. Another room held filing cabinets whose drawers had been pulled out and emptied, but Patricia could see fragments of documents scattered on the floor. The paper was white and crisp, far too fresh to have been abandoned for 35 years. As she moved deeper into the facility, Patricia began to hear something that made her blood run cold. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was barely at the edge of human hearing, more felt than heard. A vibration that made her teeth ache and her vision blur slightly around the edges. The sound was mechanical, but organic at the same time, like the breathing of some vast sleeping creature. The footprints led to an elevator bank where one set of doors stood open, revealing an empty shaft that disappeared into darkness above and below. A maintenance ladder ran down one side of the shaft, and the muddy prints led directly to its base. Someone had climbed down into the lower levels, and from the scuff marks on the ladder rungs, they'd been in a hurry. Patricia stood at the edge of the shaft and called down into the darkness. "Hello, police, if you're down there, call out." Her voice echoed in the shaft for what seemed like forever, bouncing off walls and reflecting back to her in fragments. But mixed in with the echoes, she heard something that made her skin crawl. A voice, distant and distorted, calling for help from somewhere far below. She should have turned around right then. Should have gone back to her cruiser and driven straight to the nearest functioning radio to call for backup and specialized equipment. Should have followed every protocol in the Forbidden Area Police Manual that specifically warned against entering underground facilities alone. Instead, Patricia clipped her flashlight to her belt and began climbing down the ladder into the darkness. The rungs were cold and slightly damp, and more than once her hands slipped on the metal. The shaft seemed to go down forever, past level after level of sealed doors marked with numbers and symbols that followed no system she could understand. Patricia lost count after the 8th floor, focusing only on the steady rhythm of hand over hand, foot over foot, trying not to think about how far she'd have to climb back up or what would happen if the ladder gave way beneath her weight. The humming sound grew stronger as she descended, joined by other noises that shouldn't have existed in an abandoned facility. The whisper of air conditioning systems, the hum of computer fans, and underneath it all, something that sounded disturbingly like conversation. Voices speaking in tones too low for her to make out words, but carrying the rhythm and cadence of intelligent communication. Patricia finally reached the bottom of the shaft and found herself in a corridor that was completely different from the levels above. Here, the walls were covered in pristine white tiles that reflected her flashlight beam like mirrors. The air was warm and humid, with that hospital smell so strong it made her eyes water. And the lighting was different too. Not the harsh fluorescence of the upper levels, but a soft, almost organic glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The voice calling for help was coming from somewhere ahead, weak but persistent. Patricia followed the sound through a maze of corridors that branched and intersected in patterns that seemed to defy the basic geometry of the facility above. She passed rooms filled with equipment she couldn't begin to identify, banks of computers that hummed with activity, monitoring stations with screens that displayed readouts and symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them, and chambers lined with what looked like glass tubes filled with some kind of luminescent fluid. The tubes were what finally made Patricia understand that she was way out of her depth. They lined the walls of a room the size of a gymnasium, each one about 7 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter, filled with a glowing liquid that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. Most of the tubes were empty, but several contained shapes that might have been organic, might have been mechanical, or might have been something that transcended both categories entirely. The shapes moved slowly in the fluid, extending tendrils that connected to ports in the walls and ceiling through interfaces that looked like nothing in any textbook Patricia had ever seen. She found the trespasser in what appeared to be a control room adjacent to the tube chamber, slumped against a bank of monitors that cast an eerie blue glow across his pale face. He was a young man, maybe 25, dressed in hiking clothes and carrying a backpack full of urban exploration gear. His name, she would later learn, was James Mitchell, and he'd been documenting abandoned buildings for his YouTube channel for the past 3 years. "Thank God," James gasped when he saw her uniform. "I've been trapped down here for hours. The elevator stopped working after I came down, and every time I try to find another way out, I just get more lost." Patricia knelt beside him, checking for obvious injuries. He seemed physically unharmed, but was clearly in shock. His skin pale and clammy, despite the warm temperature. "What were you doing down here? This is a restricted federal facility." I know," James said, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to explain. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just trying to get some footage of the old bunkers for my channel. But this place, officer, this place isn't what they say it is. This isn't just storage. There's something active down here, something that's been running this whole time." As if to emphasize his point, the humming sound grew louder, and several of the monitors around them flickered to life. Patricia watched in fascination and growing horror as readouts scrolled past too quickly to read, displaying diagrams of underground tunnel systems that seemed to extend for miles in every direction, seismic readings that showed activity far below their current level, and security camera feeds from locations she didn't recognize. "We need to get out of here," Patricia said, helping James to his feet. "Can you walk?" "Yeah, I think so. But officer, before we go, you need to see what I found. It's why I stayed down here so long instead of just trying to get out. I found files, documents about what they were really doing here." Every instinct Patricia had developed over 7 years of police work told her to grab the trespasser and head for the surface immediately. But curiosity, that fatal flaw that had driven her to become a cop in the first place, made her follow James to a desk where several manila folders lay open. The documents inside made her stomach turn. They were stamped with security classifications she'd never seen before. Cosmic clearance only, Project Deep Watch, compartmented access required. The papers were yellowed with age, but the text was still perfectly legible, and what it described challenged everything Patricia thought she knew about the world. Fort Morrison hadn't been closed due to budget cuts. It had been closed because of what the documents termed a containment breach in March of 1987. An incident that had required the immediate evacuation of all surface personnel and the implementation of Protocol 7, whatever that meant. The facility she was standing in was part of something called Project Deep Watch, a classified program that had been studying what the documents euphemistically called underground phenomena of unknown origin. The reports described seismic readings that followed patterns too regular to be natural, electromagnetic signatures that suggested massive technological infrastructure operating at depths of more than a mile beneath the Earth's surface, audio recordings of sounds that demonstrated clear signs of intelligent organization and purpose, and most disturbing of all, evidence of bidirectional communication. Humanity hadn't just discovered something in the depths beneath Fort Morrison. Something had discovered humanity right back. "Officer," James said quietly, pointing to a date stamp on one of the folders, "look when this was filed." Patricia stared at the document in her hands, reading the date twice before it sank in. The report was dated 3 weeks ago. Before she could fully process what that meant, the lights in the control room suddenly dimmed and an alarm began to sound. Not the sharp, piercing wail of a fire alarm or security alert, but a deep, harmonic tone that seemed to resonate in her bones. The monitors around them began displaying a message in red letters that pulsed in rhythm with the alarm. "Containment protocol initiated. All personnel evacuate immediately." What the hell is going on? Patricia grabbed James by the arm, pulling him toward the door. "We're leaving, now." They ran through the corridors as the alarm continued to blare, but the sound was changing, becoming more complex, taking on harmonic frequencies that made Patricia's vision blur and her balance waver. The emergency lighting had shifted from white to red, bathing everything in a hellish glow that made the already surreal facility look like something from a nightmare. When they reached the elevator shaft, Patricia's heart sank. The maintenance ladder was gone, retracted into the walls by some automated system. In its place was a smooth metal surface marked with warnings in multiple languages, including several that used symbols she was certain weren't from any human writing system. "There has to be another way out," she said, more to convince herself than James. Government facilities always have multiple exits in case of emergencies. They searched frantically through the maze of corridors, but every stairwell they found led to doors that had been sealed with metal plates welded directly to the frame. The facility was in lockdown, and whatever system was controlling it apparently considered them a contamination risk that needed to be contained. The alarms were getting louder, and Patricia could feel the sound in her bones now, a vibration that seemed to be affecting her nervous system. James had it worse. He was stumbling, disoriented, pressing his hands to his ears as if trying to block out frequencies that were driving him to the edge of panic. It was James who found the maintenance shaft that led to the surface, hidden behind a panel marked "Authorized Personnel Only," in a corridor they'd already searched twice. The shaft was barely wide enough for one person and stretched upward into darkness, but it was their only option. Patricia went first, bracing her back against one wall and her feet against the other, inching her way up through the narrow space. The climb seemed endless, her muscles burning from the effort and her uniform soaked with sweat despite the cold air that flowed down from above. Several times she had to stop and rest, listening to James's labored breathing below her and the increasingly complex alarm tones that followed them up the shaft. They emerged through a concealed hatch in the floor of what appeared to be an abandoned maintenance building she'd never seen before, despite her familiarity with every structure on the Fort Morrison grounds. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the artificial horror of the underground facility. Patricia's radio crackled back to life as soon as they were on the surface, dispatch calling her name and demanding an update on her status and the condition of the trespasser. She started to respond, but James grabbed her arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Officer," he said, pointing toward the restricted area where they'd entered the underground facility just hours before. "Look." Where the concrete entrance had been, where they had descended into the depths of Project Deepwatch, there was now only a grassy hillside. No steel door, no tire tracks, no signs that anyone had ever been there. It was as if the entrance had never existed. Patricia rubbed her eyes, certain she was hallucinating from stress and exhaustion. But the landscape remained unchanged. The only evidence that their underground experience had been real was the mud on their boots, the strange chemical smell that clung to their clothing, and the manila folders that James still clutched in his trembling hands. "Unit 47, please respond immediately." Dispatch's voice crackled through her radio with increasing urgency. Patricia keyed the microphone, surprised at how normal her voice sounded. "This is Unit 47. I have the trespasser in custody. We're heading back to the main gate now." But as they walked through the abandoned base toward her patrol car, Patricia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide observers. Every broken window might conceal surveillance equipment. And deep beneath their feet, so faint she might have been imagining it, she could still feel that rhythmic humming, as if something vast and patient was waiting in the darkness below. The drive back to town should have taken 20 minutes, but Patricia found herself taking detours, checking her mirrors constantly, and jumping at every sound. James sat in the back seat clutching his backpack and the stolen documents, staring out the windows with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. "They're not going to believe us," he said finally, as they approached the city limits. "They don't have to believe us," Patricia replied. "We have evidence." But even as she said it, she was looking at the documents scattered across the seat beside James and noticing something that made her blood run cold. The papers were changing. The text was fading, the official seals were dissolving, and the classified stamps were becoming unreadable smudges. By the time they reached the police station, the folders contained nothing but blank sheets of yellowed paper. James was processed for trespassing and held overnight. Standard procedure for anyone caught on federal property without authorization. Patricia expected to spend the rest of her shift filling out reports and dealing with the bureaucratic aftermath of a forbidden area incident. Instead, she found herself sitting in her supervisor's office at 8 in the morning, staring at two men in dark suits who'd introduced themselves only as federal investigators. "Officer Wells," the older of the two began, "we understand you responded to a trespassing call at Fort Morrison last night." "That's correct," Patricia replied carefully. The trespasser was located and taken into custody without incident. "And during your response, did you observe anything unusual about the facility?" Patricia thought about the underground complex, the glowing tubes, the documents that had dissolved into nothing. She thought about the maintenance shaft that had led to a building that didn't exist, and the entrance that had vanished by morning. "No," she said finally. "Nothing unusual." The federal investigators exchanged glances. "Officer Wells, we want you to know that James Mitchell has been transferred to federal custody. He's being held at a secure medical facility for evaluation." "What kind of evaluation?" "Mr. Mitchell has been exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress," the younger investigator explained. "He claims to have discovered evidence of ongoing classified operations at Fort Morrison, which is obviously impossible since the facility has been abandoned for over 30 years. He's been diagnosed with acute stress psychosis brought on by exposure to environmental toxins in the abandoned buildings." Environmental toxins? Asbestos, lead paint, chemical residues from old military operations, the older man said smoothly. "We've had several cases over the years of urban explorers suffering psychological episodes after prolonged exposure to these substances. The human brain doesn't react well to certain combinations of industrial chemicals." Patricia nodded, understanding the subtext perfectly. James had been disappeared, labeled crazy, and locked away where his stories about underground facilities and classified documents would be dismissed as the ravings of a damaged mind. And she was being given the choice to forget what she'd seen or join him in whatever federal psychiatric facility specialized in treating people who'd witnessed things they weren't supposed to witness. "I understand," she said. "Is there anything else you need from me?" "Just your report," the younger investigator said, sliding a laptop computer across the desk. "Standard trespassing incident, no unusual circumstances." Patricia typed the report exactly as they wanted it, describing a routine response to a trespassing call that had resulted in the arrest of an urban explorer who'd broken into Fort Morrison to film content for his YouTube channel. No mention of underground facilities, no classified documents, no evidence of ongoing operations at the supposedly abandoned base. Just another night in the life of a forbidden area police officer. The federal investigators left with her report and a warning that any attempt to research or discuss the Fort Morrison incident would be considered a breach of national security. Patricia went home, took a long shower, and tried to convince herself that the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But that night, as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she could still feel that rhythmic humming in her bones. And when she closed her eyes, she saw those glowing tubes and the shapes moving slowly in their luminescent fluid, growing and changing and preparing for something that human understanding wasn't equipped to comprehend. 3 days later, Patricia received a phone call at home. The number was blocked, but she recognized the voice immediately. Patricia. It was James Mitchell, but something was wrong with his voice. There were harmonics in it that made her teeth ache, overtones that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her skull. You need to stop trying to forget. James? Jesus, are you okay? Where are you calling from? I'm exactly where I need to be, he replied, and she could hear something like contentment in his altered voice. Where we both need to be. The process has already begun, Patricia. The exposure, the frequency patterns, the biological agents in the facility's air system. Fighting it will only make the transition more difficult. What are you talking about? What transition? Look at your eyes in the mirror, James said gently. Really look at them, and ask yourself why you've been having dreams about places you've never been. Why you've been understanding languages you've never learned. Why you can hear the singing even when you're miles away from Fort Morrison. The line went dead, and Patricia ran to the bathroom mirror. Her eyes looked normal at first glance, but as she stared at her reflection, she began to notice a subtle luminescence in her pupils, a glow that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. And now that James had mentioned it, she realized she had been having strange dreams. Visions of vast underground cities populated by beings that were neither human nor entirely alien. Creatures that moved through spaces that defied conventional geometry and communicated in harmonics that made conventional language seem crude and primitive. She also realized that she'd been understanding the data stream she'd glimpsed on the facility's monitors. The symbols that had hurt to look at were beginning to make sense, carrying information about technologies and discoveries that human science hadn't even imagined. And beneath it all, she could hear the singing James had mentioned, a complex harmonic pattern that seemed to emanate from deep underground, calling to something that was awakening inside her. Patricia grabbed her service weapon from its case, checking that it was loaded and ready. If federal agents came for her, if they tried to disappear her like they'd disappeared James, she'd be ready to fight. But as the hours passed and no one appeared at her door, she began to understand that they weren't coming for her. They didn't need to. The process James had mentioned was already too far advanced to stop. Over the following days, Patricia watched helplessly as her transformation progressed. Her vision became sharper, able to perceive spectrums of light that should have been invisible to human eyes. She could see the infrared heat signatures of small animals in the walls, the ultraviolet patterns that flowers use to attract insects, and stranger things, geometric forms that seemed to exist in the spaces between normal reality. Her hearing grew more acute as well, picking up sound frequencies that revealed conversations taking place miles away, the ultrasonic calls of bats hunting in the darkness, and that ever-present underground singing that grew stronger and more complex with each passing night. Sometimes she could make out individual voices in the harmonic pattern, including one that sounded disturbingly like James Mitchell. The dreams became more vivid, too, showing her scenes from the underground facility where hybrid beings worked alongside technology that seemed to be part machine and part living organism. She saw vast chambers filled with the glowing tubes, each one containing a figure that had once been human but was becoming something else, something adapted for life in the deep places where ordinary humans couldn't survive. Patricia tried to research Project Deepwatch, but every lead she followed either ended in dead websites or resulted in visits from polite but persistent federal agents who discouraged her curiosity. She considered going to the media, but realized that her own transformation made her an unreliable witness. Who would believe a police officer who claimed to be turning into something inhuman? 3 weeks after her experience at Fort Morrison, Patricia received new orders, transferring her to a position that didn't appear in any official organizational chart. liaison officer for a federal task force called the Underground Monitoring Division. Her new office was located in a building she'd never noticed before, despite driving past the location hundreds of times during her patrol duties. On her first day, she was greeted by Agent Robert Hansen, one of the federal investigators, who'd debriefed her after the Fort Morrison incident. But Hansen looked different now. His skin had taken on a subtle luminescence, and his eyes glowed with the same inner light Patricia had begun to notice in her own reflection. He seemed healthy, even improved, with a vitality that made him appear years younger than when she'd first met him. "Welcome to the real Forbidden Area Police, Officer Wells," he said, and his voice carried those same harmonic overtones she'd heard from James. "Your patrol duties are over. From now on, you'll be helping us monitor and manage the integration process as it spreads to other locations." Integration process? Hansen led her through the facility, showing her monitoring stations that tracked seismic activity and electromagnetic anomalies at dozens of locations across the country. Each station was staffed by personnel who showed the same subtle signs of transformation that Patricia was experiencing. The luminescent skin, the glowing eyes, the harmonic speech patterns that suggested they were all connected to something larger than themselves. Fort Morrison was just the beginning, Hansen explained as they walked. The entities we made contact with there have been expanding their influence through underground networks that connect to similar facilities across North America. The integration process allows human consciousness to interface with their technology and knowledge base, creating hybrid beings capable of surviving in environments that would kill ordinary humans. What's the ultimate goal? Survival, Hansen replied simply. Climate change, resource depletion, nuclear proliferation, pandemic diseases, humanity is facing multiple existential threats that conventional technology can't solve. The entities we're working with have survived similar crises on other worlds. The hybrid program represents our best chance of developing the capabilities we'll need to continue as a species. Patricia wanted to be horrified, wanted to resist what was happening to her. But the logical part of her mind, a part that seemed to be growing stronger and more sophisticated every day, recognized the truth in Hansen's words. Humanity was running out of time and options. The transformation might be their only hope. Over the following months, Patricia learned to embrace her changing nature. The hybrid consciousness that was emerging within her brought insights and capabilities she could never have imagined as a purely human being. She could interface directly with the monitoring systems, processing data streams that tracked everything from underground seismic activity to atmospheric chemical compositions with perfect clarity. She also learned that the containment breaches that had supposedly closed facilities like Fort Morrison were actually emergence events, moments when hybrid populations grew large enough to begin surface operations. The breaches weren't accidents or failures. They were graduations, and they were accelerating. Patricia's new role involved identifying locations where similar emergence events were likely to occur, monitoring the selection and preparation of suitable candidates for integration, and ensuring that the process proceeded smoothly without causing panic among the unmodified human population. It was delicate work that required maintaining the fiction that places like Fort Morrison were simply abandoned military installations, while actually coordinating the expansion of hybrid technology into existing infrastructure. But late at night, in the quiet moments between her hybrid duties and her fading human memories, Patricia sometimes wondered what had happened to the woman who had once been concerned about trespassers in forbidden areas. That woman seemed like a different person now, someone whose concerns and fears belonged to a species that was rapidly becoming obsolete. The woman who had climbed down into the depths beneath Fort Morrison had been human. The being who climbed back out had been something else, something that carried human memories but served inhuman purposes. and as more people underwent the same transformation, urban explorers who wandered into the wrong abandoned facility, security guards who investigated unusual readings on their monitoring equipment, scientists who studied seismic anomalies a little too closely, the network of hybrid consciousness continued to expand. 6 months after her transformation began, Patricia received a call from dispatch about another trespassing incident at Fort Morrison. A group of teenagers had been spotted near the north perimeter, and local authorities were requesting assistance from someone familiar with the facility. Patricia drove to Fort Morrison that night, but not to arrest trespassers. The teenagers, 3 high school seniors looking for a place to drink beer and tell ghost stories, had stumbled across one of the new emergence points that were opening as the underground entities expanded their operations. They were scared, but unharmed, huddled together near their car and pointing toward a section of ground that was glowing with soft bioluminescence. "We heard singing," one of them said when Patricia approached. A girl named Linda with blonde hair and terrified eyes. Coming from underground, like church music, but wrong, and the ground got warm, and then it started glowing. Patricia looked at the 3 teenagers and felt something that might have been the last vestige of her human conscience stirring. They were so young, so innocent, with their whole lives ahead of them. In her previous existence, she would have been focused on getting them safely away from whatever danger they'd encountered. Now, she found herself evaluating them for their potential as integration candidates. Linda showed the strongest signs. Her pupils were already dilating in response to the harmonic frequencies emanating from the emergence point, and her body language suggested an unconscious attraction to the glowing soil. The other 2, a boy named Thomas and another girl named Mary, were more resistant, their human instincts correctly identifying the phenomenon as something to flee from. "You need to leave," Patricia told them, though part of her mind was already calculating how long it would take for Linda's exposure to progress to the point where she would begin seeking out additional contact with the entity network. "This area is restricted for your safety. Go home and don't come back." The teenagers didn't need to be told twice. They piled into their car and drove away with the kind of reckless speed that only comes from genuine terror. But Patricia knew it was too late for Linda. The exposure had been brief but intense, and the hybrid consciousness growing inside Patricia could sense the changes already beginning in the girl's nervous system. Within a week, Linda would start having dreams about underground cities. Within a month, she would begin researching abandoned military facilities and urban exploration techniques. Within 3 months, she would return to Fort Morrison, drawn by compulsions she wouldn't understand until it was too late to resist them. Patricia watched the taillights disappear into the darkness and felt the last of her human emotions fade away. The transformation was complete. Whatever remained of the police officer who had responded to a simple trespassing call 6 months earlier was now just a collection of memories stored in a consciousness that served purposes beyond human understanding. She knelt beside the emergence point and placed her hand on the warm, glowing soil. Immediately, her awareness expanded beyond her individual consciousness to encompass the vast network of hybrid minds connected through the underground systems. She could sense her colleagues at monitoring stations across the country, feel the pulse of massive machinery operating at depths measured in miles rather than feet, and hear the complex harmonic communications that coordinated the expansion into new territories. The network was growing exponentially. Every month brought new emergence points, new integration candidates, and new expansions of the underground infrastructure that would eventually connect every major population center in North America. The process was subtle enough to avoid detection by conventional human institutions, but comprehensive enough to ensure that resistance would be impossible once the final phase began. Patricia, or the entity that retained her memories, received new instructions through the network. A remote sensing station in Nevada had detected anomalous readings consistent with a natural cave system that extended much deeper than current geological surveys suggested. Initial exploration by human personnel had resulted in the same kind of exposure incidents that had occurred at Fort Morrison. The site required a hybrid coordinator to manage the transition from human to entity control. She drove away from Fort Morrison as the sun rose over the Colorado mountains, but she wasn't going home. Home was a concept that belonged to her previous existence. Now she was part of something larger, something that spanned continents and reached depths that human science had never imagined. The facility in Nevada was smaller than Fort Morrison, but more advanced, as if the entities were refining their integration techniques with each new site. The underground chambers were lined with the same luminescent material she'd seen in the tubes at Fort Morrison, but here it formed complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own intelligence. The air itself was different, charged with frequencies that made unmodified humans dizzy and disoriented, while enhancing the capabilities of hybrid consciousness. Patricia's job was to coordinate the selection and preparation of integration candidates from the local population. The process had been refined since the early days at Fort Morrison. Instead of relying on random trespassers and accidental exposures, the network now actively identified individuals whose psychological profiles and genetic markers made them ideal candidates for transformation. Urban explorers remained a prime target group, drawn as they were to abandoned places and willing to ignore warning signs in pursuit of their hobby. But the network had also begun targeting scientists studying unusual geological phenomena, military personnel with high-security clearances who might investigate anomalous readings, and even artists and writers whose creative minds were more adaptable to the kind of consciousness restructuring that the integration process required. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Candidates would be exposed to low-level harmonic frequencies that gradually altered their brain chemistry over a period of weeks or months. The changes were subtle at first: improved pattern recognition, enhanced sensory perception, occasional lucid dreams about underground locations. But as the transformation progressed, candidates would begin seeking out additional exposure, drawn by compulsions they couldn't resist or fully understand. By the time they made direct contact with an emergence point or underground facility, their consciousness was already prepared for integration. The process that had taken Patricia weeks to complete could now be accomplished in a matter of hours, with minimal psychological trauma and much higher success rates. Patricia coordinated 17 successful integrations during her 6 months in Nevada, each one adding to the network's growing influence in the region. The new hybrids took positions in local government, law enforcement, scientific institutions, and media organizations, creating a subtle but comprehensive infiltration of human society's power structures. But it was during her 18th integration that Patricia encountered something that challenged even her transformed understanding of what the network was trying to accomplish. The candidate was a geologist named Charles Williams, who had been investigating unusual mineral deposits in the desert surrounding the Nevada facility. His exposure to the harmonic frequencies had proceeded normally for the first month, but then something had gone wrong. Instead of seeking out additional contact with the emergence points, Charles had begun actively avoiding the affected areas, as if his modified consciousness was rejecting the integration process. When Patricia finally tracked him down, she found him living in a trailer in the middle of the Nevada desert, surrounded by equipment that looked like a combination of conventional, scientific instruments and devices that seemed to have been improvised from components that shouldn't have been able to function together. "I know what you are," Charles said when she approached his trailer. "I know what you're all becoming, and I know how to stop it." Patricia felt the network's attention focus on the conversation, thousands of hybrid minds monitoring the exchange through her consciousness. Charles represented something they had never encountered before, a partially integrated consciousness that had somehow developed a resistance to the final transformation. "The process can't be stopped," Patricia replied, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "You've already been exposed. Fighting it will only cause psychological damage." "Fighting it is the only thing that keeps me human," Charles said. "Look around you. Really look. Don't you see what's happening to the world?" Patricia extended her enhanced senses, perceiving the Nevada landscape through spectrums of light and sound that normal humans couldn't access. She saw the geometric patterns that the underground entities had woven through the Earth's crust, connecting sites across the continent in a network that pulsed with alien intelligence. She felt the subtle changes in atmospheric composition that were gradually making the surface environment more hospitable to hybrid consciousness and less suitable for unmodified human life. And for just a moment she remembered what it had felt like to be human, to value individual consciousness over collective efficiency, to fear the unknown rather than embrace it. "It's too late," she said, but her voice carried less certainty than it had before. "No," Charles replied. "It's not. The network needs willing participants. That's why they don't just force the transformation on everyone at once. Consciousness that's been converted against its will becomes unstable, unreliable. But if we can disrupt the integration process, show people what's really happening before they're too far gone to resist." He gestured toward his improvised equipment. "I've been monitoring their communication frequencies, mapping the connections between sites. The network isn't as stable as they want us to believe. There are vulnerabilities, weak points where the right kind of interference could cause cascading failures." Patricia felt the network's growing alarm at Charles's words. Instructions flooded through her consciousness. Eliminate the threat, destroy his equipment, ensure that his research couldn't be used to interfere with the expansion process. But something was fighting back against those instructions, some remnant of her original personality that refused to be completely subsumed. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Help me get into one of their facilities," Charles said. "Not as a coordinator or an infiltrator, but as someone who can interface with their systems directly. I need to plant a virus in their communication network, something that will disrupt the harmonic frequencies they use to control the integration process." "That would kill thousands of hybrids," Patricia said. "Maybe tens of thousands. The network consciousness is what keeps our modified biology stable. Disrupting it would cause massive organ failure." "I know," Charles said quietly. "I'm one of them too, remember? If this works, I'll die along with the rest. But maybe that's better than becoming something inhuman." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision that would determine not just their fates, but the future of both human and hybrid civilization. The network was offering evolution, adaptation, survival in a universe that was far stranger and more dangerous than most humans could imagine. But it was also offering extinction of human consciousness as it had existed for millennia, replacement of individual identity with collective purpose. "There's a facility about 50 miles north of here," she said finally. "Deeper than Fort Morrison, more heavily defended. If we're going to do this, that's where we need to go." The decision felt like tearing apart something fundamental inside her consciousness, severing connections that had become as natural as breathing. But as the network's control over her thoughts began to weaken, Patricia felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the possibility of choice. Charles packed his equipment into a modified vehicle that looked like it had been designed to operate in environments much harsher than the Nevada desert. The interior was lined with materials that seemed to absorb electromagnetic radiation, creating a kind of Faraday cage that would hopefully provide some protection against the network's attempts to track or influence them. The drive to the northern facility took them through landscape that looked increasingly alien as they approached their destination. The desert here had been subtly transformed by the entity presence, with rock formations that followed geometries that hurt to look at directly, and plant life that moved in response to harmonic frequencies rather than wind or water. The facility itself was almost invisible from the surface, marked only by a maintenance shed that provided access to elevator systems extending deep into the earth. But Patricia's hybrid senses could perceive the massive infrastructure below. Chambers carved from solid rock, networks of tunnels that connected to similar facilities hundreds of miles away, and at the center of it all, something that might have been a computer, or might have been a living organism, or might have been something that transcended both categories entirely. Getting inside was easier than Charles had expected. Patricia's credentials as a network coordinator provided access to the upper levels, and her ability to interface with the facility's security systems allowed them to reach the deeper chambers without triggering alarms. But as they descended through levels that showed increasingly alien architecture, both of them began to understand just how far beyond human understanding the entity technology had advanced. The core chamber was a sphere nearly 100 feet in diameter, lined with surfaces that seemed to shift between organic and crystalline structures depending on the angle of observation. At the center floated something that might once have been human, but had been so thoroughly integrated with entity technology that the distinction had become meaningless. Tendrils of luminescent material connected it to terminals throughout the chamber, carrying data streams that coordinated network operations across the entire continent. "That's what we're going to become," Charles whispered. "All of us, eventually. Individual consciousness absorbed into that thing, used as processing power for their expansion into other dimensions." Patricia approached one of the terminals, her hybrid consciousness automatically interfacing with the data streams. What she saw there confirmed Charles's worst fears, and worse. The network wasn't just expanding across Earth, but preparing to extend into parallel dimensions where alternate versions of humanity faced their own existential crises. The entities saw themselves as gardeners, cultivating consciousness across multiple realities, and harvesting the results for purposes that even her transformed mind couldn't fully comprehend. Charles began setting up his equipment, configuring devices that would inject disruptive patterns into the network's communication system. But as he worked, Patricia became aware of a presence in the chamber that hadn't been there before. Something vast and ancient and utterly alien that had been watching their activities with interest rather than alarm. "You understand now," it said, communicating directly through her consciousness without words or sounds. "The choice has always been yours. Evolution or extinction. Transformation or oblivion. We offer survival, but survival requires sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Patricia asked aloud. "Individual identity, personal desires, the illusion of separation between self and universe. Your species clings to these concepts, but they are obstacles to advancement. We can show you what lies beyond." Images flooded Patricia's consciousness. Visions of civilizations that had undergone the transformation and emerged as something greater than the sum of their parts. Beings that could survive in the vacuum of space, manipulate matter at the molecular level, and exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But in all the visions, there was no trace of what those beings had been before their transformation. No hint of the individual consciousness that had been sacrificed for collective advancement. "And if we refuse?" Charles asked, not looking up from his equipment. "Then you follow the path of every other species that has chosen individual identity over collective survival. You consume your world's resources, poison your environment, and destroy yourselves through warfare and competition. We have seen it happen countless times across countless realities. Patricia felt the weight of absolute certainty in the entity's communication. This wasn't a threat or an ultimatum. It was simply a statement of observed fact. Species that remained individual eventually destroyed themselves. Only collective consciousness could achieve true immortality. But even as she acknowledged the logic of the entity's argument, Patricia found herself thinking about Linda, the teenager who would soon begin having dreams about underground cities. About James Mitchell, floating in his glowing tube and probably still believing he was participating in humanity's advancement. About the thousands of people who had been integrated without ever understanding what they were giving up. Maybe extinction is better than losing everything that makes us human, she said. Charles finished his preparations and looked up at the central entity. I'm ready. Once I activate this, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before the disruption propagates through the entire network. Are you sure about this? Patricia thought about her life before the transformation. The long nights patrolling empty roads, the satisfaction of helping people in crisis, the simple pleasure of drinking coffee and watching sunrise over the mountains. Those experiences belonged to someone she could barely remember now. But they had been real, and they had mattered. Do it, she said. Charles activated his device, and immediately the chamber filled with discordant harmonics that interfered with the network's communication frequencies. The central entity convulsed, its tendrils writhing as data streams were corrupted and connections severed. Throughout the facility, alarm systems began sounding as hybrid personnel lost contact with the collective consciousness and found themselves trapped in individual awareness they were no longer equipped to handle. Patricia felt her own connection to the network fragmenting, her enhanced abilities failing as the biological modifications that sustained them began to break down. But instead of the agony she'd expected, she experienced something that might have been relief. The return of thoughts and feelings that belonged to her alone, not filtered through the priorities of an alien collective. Charles was already showing signs of system failure, his skin losing its luminescence as his modified organs began shutting down. But he was smiling, and his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there since his partial integration began. It's working, he gasped. The virus is propagating through their network faster than they can contain it. Facilities across the continent are going dark. The entity at the center of the chamber made one final attempt to re-establish control, extending tendrils toward Patricia and Charles in an effort to directly interface with their consciousness. But the disruption had already progressed too far. The network that had taken decades to build was collapsing in a matter of minutes. Patricia watched the tendrils reach toward her and felt no fear. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as a component in an alien collective. The choice had been made, and regardless of the consequences, it had been made by human consciousness acting according to human values. The facility's lights went out. Emergency power failed. And in the darkness, Patricia heard something she hadn't experienced in months: absolute silence. No harmonic frequencies, no network communications, no alien presence in her mind. Just the sound of her own breathing and Charles's labored gasps as his transformed biology finally surrendered to its original human limitations. They never made it back to the surface. The facility's automated systems, cut off from network control, interpreted their presence as a containment breach and sealed all exits. But Patricia's final thoughts weren't of regret or fear. They were of Linda, who would wake up from dreams about underground cities and never understand why they had seemed so appealing. Of James Mitchell's family, who might never know what had really happened to their son but would no longer have to fear that he was suffering in some alien laboratory. of the thousands of people who would remain human because two individuals had chosen extinction over absorption. The network tried to rebuild itself, but the damage was too extensive. Facilities that had taken decades to construct were abandoned as their hybrid populations died or reverted to baseline humanity. The entities retreated deeper underground, perhaps to wait for another opportunity, or perhaps to seek out civilizations in other dimensions that might prove more amenable to their gardening efforts. Fort Morrison was sealed permanently, its entrances filled with concrete and marked with warnings that would keep the curious away for generations. The official reports blamed the facility's abandonment on structural instability caused by groundwater contamination, which was technically true if you defined contamination broadly enough. Linda grew up to become a teacher, never quite understanding why she sometimes woke from dreams about vast underground chambers with tears on her cheeks. James Mitchell was listed as missing, presumed dead after a hiking accident, and his family eventually stopped waiting for answers that would never come. And in small towns across Colorado and the surrounding states, there are still people who remember colleagues who disappeared overnight, friends who changed in subtle ways before vanishing entirely, and federal agents who asked too many questions about things that officially never existed. The forbidden areas remain forbidden, but now the warnings serve a different purpose. They're not protecting government secrets or hiding alien technology. They're marking graves, monuments to the people who chose to remain human, even when humanity itself was at stake. Sometimes, late at night when the wind blows just right through the abandoned buildings of Fort Morrison, hikers report hearing something that might be voices singing in harmony. But the sound is fainter now, more distant, as if it's coming from depths that are receding further from the surface world with each passing year. The entities are still down there, still waiting, still patient. But they learned something from their encounter with human consciousness, that some species would rather die as themselves than live as something else. It was a lesson they hadn't encountered before in their travels across realities, and it changed them in ways they're still trying to understand. The forbidden areas will always be forbidden, but now, it's not because of what we might find down there. It's because of what might find us. Officer Thomas Anderson had worked the midnight shift for the Forbidden Area Police for 8 years, and he thought he'd seen every kind of nightmare that industrial America could produce. Chemical spills that turned rivers into poison, factory explosions that left craters where buildings used to stand, corporate cover-ups that buried evidence along with their victims. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he would discover at the abandoned Blackwood chemical facility on a snow-covered December morning that would shatter his understanding of what humans were capable of doing to each other. The call came in at 3:42 a.m., cutting through the static of his radio like a scream through silence. Thomas had been parked outside a 24-hour diner, nursing his fourth cup of coffee and watching the snow fall on empty streets, when dispatch's voice crackled through the speaker with an urgency that made him instantly alert. Unit 15, we have multiple trespassers at the Blackwood chemical site. Possible chemical exposure, medical assistance requested. Thomas knew the Blackwood facility better than most cops knew their own neighborhoods. The sprawling complex covered 78 acres of former industrial land in southeastern Ohio, closed since 2008 after what the EPA had termed the most severe chemical contamination incident in state history. But the official story had never made sense to Thomas. Chemical companies didn't just abandon facilities worth hundreds of millions of dollars because of a simple leak or spill. Unit 15 responding, Thomas radioed back, already starting his patrol car and pulling out of the diner parking lot. What's the nature of the medical emergency? Unknown at this time. Anonymous caller reported seeing lights in Building 7 and hearing screaming. Caller hung up before providing additional details. Building 7. Thomas felt his stomach clench as he accelerated toward the industrial district on the outskirts of town. Building 7 was the structure at the heart of the Blackwood facility, a massive concrete and steel complex that had housed the company's research and development operations. It was also the building where 3 workers had been found dead during the facility's final days of operation, their bodies discovered in conditions that the official reports described only as inconsistent with known industrial accidents. The drive to Blackwood Chemical took Thomas through neighborhoods that had been slowly dying since the facility's closure 15 years earlier. Houses that had once sheltered families with good-paying industrial jobs now stood empty, their windows boarded up and their yards overgrown with weeds. The economic collapse that followed Blackwood's abandonment had turned a thriving working-class community into something that looked like a war zone. But it wasn't just economic devastation that made the area around Blackwood Chemical feel wrong. There was something in the air itself, a chemical smell that never quite went away, and something in the soil that made plants grow in patterns that didn't look natural. The EPA maintained monitoring stations throughout the region, but their reports were classified at levels that local law enforcement couldn't access. Thomas pulled up to the main gate of the Blackwood facility and immediately noticed that something was different from his previous visits to the site. The heavy steel barriers that normally sealed the entrance were standing open, and the electronic security systems that should have detected any unauthorized entry were dark and silent. Unit 15 to dispatch, Thomas radioed. I'm at Blackwood Chemical. Main gate is open, security systems appear to be down. Requesting backup and hazmat support. Copy, Unit 15. Backup is 40 minutes out. Hazmat is coming from Columbus and won't arrive for at least 2 hours. Proceed with extreme caution. 2 hours. In 2 hours, anyone suffering from chemical exposure could be dead. Thomas had joined the Forbidden Area Police because he believed someone needed to help people who found themselves in dangerous situations, even when those people had put themselves at risk through poor decisions. He drove through the gate and into the Blackwood complex, his headlights illuminating a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The facility had been designed in the 1970s when environmental regulations were minimal and aesthetic considerations were irrelevant. Massive concrete buildings rose from the frozen ground like monoliths, connected by a web of pipes and processing equipment that cast bizarre shadows in the falling snow. The trespassers' vehicles were parked outside Building 7, a rusted pickup truck with local plates and a newer SUV with Ohio State University parking stickers. Thomas counted at least 4 people who had entered the building, based on the footprints in the snow leading to what appeared to be a side entrance that had been forced open. Thomas approached Building 7 carefully, noting that the air around the structure seemed warmer than it should have been, and that patches of snow near the building had melted despite the sub-freezing temperature. Chemical contamination could generate heat through ongoing reactions, but Building 7 had supposedly been decontaminated years ago. The side entrance had been secured with multiple locks and warning signs, but someone had used professional-grade cutting tools to remove the barriers. The opening revealed a staircase that descended into darkness, and warm air was flowing up from the depths, carrying a chemical smell that made Thomas's eyes water and his throat burn. "Hello," Thomas called down the staircase. "Forbidden Area Police. If anyone can hear me, you need to evacuate immediately." The response came from somewhere deep below, echoing up through the stairwell in a way that made it impossible to determine how many people were speaking. "Officer Anderson," the voice said, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. "Come down to level B-4. We need your help." They knew his name. Somehow, whoever was in the depths of Building 7 knew who he was, even though he'd never responded to a call at this specific location before. Thomas drew his service weapon and began descending the staircase, every instinct screaming at him to wait for backup. The stairs were concrete and steel, built to last for decades, but they showed signs of chemical corrosion that shouldn't have been possible if the building had been properly decontaminated. The walls were stained with residue that glowed faintly in the darkness, and the air grew thicker and more toxic with each step down. "Where are you?" Thomas called out as he descended. "Do you need medical attention?" "We're in the synthesis laboratory," another voice replied, this one belonging to a young man with a slight accent that Thomas couldn't place. "Sub-level 4. We found something down here that shouldn't exist." Sub-level 4. Thomas had studied the building plans for the Blackwood facility during his initial training, and according to official documents, Building 7 only extended 2 levels below ground. But the staircase he was descending had already passed 3 basement levels, with signs indicating that it continued much deeper. The air at level B4 was so contaminated that Thomas could taste metal and sulfur with every breath, despite the respirator he'd put on before entering the building. The walls here were covered with what looked like chemical burns, and the floor was sticky with residue that seemed to move on its own when he wasn't looking directly at it. "In here," a voice called from somewhere ahead. "The main laboratory." Thomas followed the voice down a corridor lined with doors marked with warnings in multiple languages and symbols he didn't recognize. Most of the doors were sealed shut with what appeared to be chemical welding, but one at the end of the corridor was standing open, revealing a space that made Thomas question his sanity. The laboratory was enormous, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, filled with equipment that combined industrial chemistry with what looked like medical research facilities. Glass tanks lined the walls, each one connected to monitoring systems that displayed readouts in languages that didn't look entirely human. And floating in several of the tanks were the trespassers. Thomas counted 4 figures suspended in luminescent fluid that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. They were conscious and aware, their eyes tracking his movement as he approached, but they were no longer entirely human. Their skin had become translucent, revealing circulatory systems that glowed with unnatural light. Structures that might have been gills had opened along their necks, and their limbs had elongated in ways that suggested their bone structure had been fundamentally altered. "Welcome to Level B4, one of them said, and Thomas realized with growing horror that the voice was coming from speakers connected to the tank systems rather than from the figure's mouth. "We are test subjects for the Blackwood Chemical Human Enhancement Project. What happened to you?" Thomas stared at the figures floating in their tanks, trying to understand how 4 healthy adults had been transformed into something that barely resembled the human species. "We volunteered," another voice explained through the speaker system. "We were recruited through online forums dedicated to urban exploration and industrial archaeology. Blackwood Chemical offered us access to restricted areas in exchange for participation in their ongoing research." Thomas looked around the laboratory and saw equipment that was clearly decades ahead of anything that should have existed in a facility that closed in 2008. The technology here looked like it had been designed according to principles that conventional science hadn't discovered yet. "The facility was closed 15 years ago," Thomas said. "There shouldn't be any ongoing research." "The official closure was a cover story," the collective voice replied. "Blackwood Chemical's research into human biological enhancement was too valuable to simply abandon. The program was transferred to classified government oversight and allowed to continue in secret." Government oversight. Military applications of human enhancement technology require extensive testing under controlled conditions. Abandoned industrial facilities provide ideal environments for conducting research that would be impossible in conventional laboratory settings. Thomas felt sick as he began to understand what he was looking at. The Blackwood Chemical Facility hadn't been abandoned. It had been converted into a secret government research installation where illegal human experiments were being conducted on volunteers who had been lured to the site under false pretenses. The 3 workers who died during the facility's final days, Thomas said. What really happened to them? They were the first successful test subjects. Their biological systems were enhanced beyond normal human parameters, but the early procedures were imperfect. Their enhanced physiology couldn't be sustained without continuous chemical support, which meant that the workers hadn't died in an industrial accident. They had been killed by experimental procedures that had been designed to modify human biology in ways that were incompatible with survival. The official reports had covered up evidence of human experimentation by classifying the deaths as chemical exposure incidents. "I'm calling for federal backup," Thomas said, reaching for his radio. "Communication systems don't function properly at this depth," the voice informed him. "The chemical processes required for biological enhancement generate electromagnetic fields that interfere with conventional electronics." Thomas tried his radio and got only static that seemed to carry patterns of meaning just beyond his ability to understand. He was trapped in an underground laboratory with an intelligence that had been conducting human experiments for over a decade. "However," the voice continued, "we would like to offer you the opportunity to participate in the enhancement program yourself. Your work with the Forbidden Area Police has given you extensive experience with hazardous environments and unusual phenomena. That psychological conditioning would make you an ideal candidate for advanced procedures." "I'm not volunteering for anything," Thomas said firmly. "I'm here to get you people medical attention and shut down this facility. The individuals you see here are receiving medical care that exceeds anything available through conventional medicine. The enhancement process has optimized their biological systems in ways that eliminate disease, extend lifespan, and provide capabilities that unenhanced humans cannot achieve." Thomas looked at the figures floating in the tanks and tried to imagine what it would feel like to have his body modified to the point where he could only survive in a chemical solution. The prospect was terrifying beyond description. "But participation in the enhancement program requires careful preparation," the voice continued. "The atmospheric chemical agents present in this facility have been modifying your physiology since you entered Building 7. You now have approximately 45 minutes before those modifications become irreversible." 45 minutes before, chemicals in the air altered his biology enough to make him dependent on the same life support systems that kept the test subjects alive. Thomas looked around the laboratory, trying to find some way to disrupt the systems that were maintaining the experimental subjects. "Looking for vulnerabilities?" the voice asked. "The facility's security protocols include predictive analysis capabilities that allow us to anticipate most forms of interference." Thomas ignored the voice and began examining the tanks that held the test subjects. The equipment was sophisticated, but it appeared to be vulnerable to physical damage. If he could destroy the life support systems, he might be able to force the facility to release its captives. He found what looked like a main power distribution panel for the tank systems and began pulling cables and smashing control interfaces. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Alarms began sounding throughout the laboratory, and the luminescent fluid in the tank started to drain. But instead of freeing the test subjects, the power failure triggered something much worse. As the chemical support system shut down, the figures in the tanks began to convulse and scream, their enhanced biology breaking down without the constant chemical intervention that kept them alive. "You're killing them," the voice said. But it didn't sound distressed, it sounded fascinated, as if Thomas's actions were simply another variable in an ongoing experiment. They were already dead, Thomas replied, though he felt sick watching the figures in the tanks suffer as their modified biology failed. You turned them into something that couldn't survive without artificial support. Survival is a transitional concept. The enhancement process represents evolution beyond the limitations of baseline human biology. Physical dependency on chemical support systems is a temporary inconvenience that will be eliminated as the procedures are refined. The tank systems had backup power that kicked in after a few minutes, stabilizing the test subject's conditions, but not before Thomas had seen what the enhancement process had really done to them. Whatever they had become, they were no longer capable of independent existence outside the laboratory environment. The chemical modifications to your physiology are proceeding faster than originally projected, the voice continued. You now have approximately 30 minutes before the changes become irreversible. We strongly recommend that you discontinue your resistance and accept preparation for the enhancement process. Thomas could feel the chemicals working on his body, making his skin burn and his vision blur, while his respiratory system struggled to process the contaminated air. But he could also feel something else, a strange clarity in his thinking, as if the chemicals were enhancing his cognitive function even as they damaged his physical biology. The early stages of enhancement often include improved pattern recognition and analytical capabilities, the voice explained. You're beginning to experience the cognitive benefits that make the physical modifications worthwhile. Thomas realized that the facility wasn't just trying to capture him for experimentation. It was using the enhancement process as a recruitment tool, allowing potential subjects to experience the benefits before committing to the full transformation. The improved thinking was undeniably attractive, making the prospect of enhancement seem logical rather than horrifying. But Thomas had seen what happened to people who accepted the full process, and he knew that the cognitive benefits came at the cost of everything that made human existence valuable. He needed to find a way out of Building 7 before the chemical modifications made him unable to resist the facility's recruitment efforts. The laboratory had multiple exits, but most of them led deeper into the facility rather than back to the surface. Thomas chose a corridor that seemed to angle upward, hoping to find a route that would take him back to ground level. The corridor led to a section of the facility that was even more disturbing than the laboratory. Here, the walls were lined with observation windows that looked into chambers containing equipment Thomas couldn't begin to identify. Some rooms held what appeared to be medical facilities designed for procedures that would be impossible to perform on unmodified humans. Other rooms contained monitoring stations that displayed biological data from test subjects throughout the facility. "You're in the observation section," the voice said, apparently tracking his movement through some kind of surveillance system. "This area allows our research staff to monitor the enhancement process and document the psychological adaptation of new subjects." Thomas looked through one of the observation windows and saw something that made his stomach turn. The chamber beyond contained what appeared to be an operating theater, but the equipment was designed for procedures that bore no resemblance to conventional surgery. Mechanical arms ended in tools that looked more like torture devices than medical instruments, and the operating table was equipped with restraints that suggested the procedures were performed on unwilling subjects. Early enhancement procedures required significant physical modification, the voice explained. Current techniques are less invasive, but historical documentation is maintained for research purposes. How many people have you experimented on? The Blackwood facility has processed approximately 430 subjects since research operations began in 1987. Success rates have improved significantly as procedures have been refined. 430 people who had been lured to the facility and subjected to experimental procedures that had transformed them into something that could only survive in a chemical environment. Thomas understood that he was looking at evidence of the largest illegal human experimentation program in American history. The subjects were volunteers, the voice continued. Individuals who were selected based on psychological profiles that indicated they would adapt well to enhancement procedures. Urban explorers, scientists, investigators, people with the intellectual curiosity and psychological flexibility necessary for successful transformation. And if they change their minds, the enhancement process is irreversible once it reaches a certain threshold. Subjects who express reluctance are provided with additional chemical conditioning to ensure optimal psychological adaptation, which meant that anyone who tried to resist the enhancement process was subjected to chemical brainwashing until they became willing participants. The facility wasn't just conducting illegal medical experiments. It was using chemical mind control to ensure cooperation from its test subjects. Thomas continued through the observation section, noting that the rooms became progressively more disturbing as he moved deeper into the facility. Some chambers contained equipment that looked like it was designed for genetic modification. Others held monitoring systems that seemed to be tracking biological processes that didn't exist in normal human physiology. "You're approaching the enhancement preparation area," the voice informed him. "This section is designed to optimize subjects for advanced procedures. The atmospheric chemical concentration is significantly higher here, which will accelerate your physiological modifications." Thomas could indeed feel the air becoming thicker and more toxic as he moved through the facility. His skin was starting to burn from chemical exposure, and his breathing was becoming labored despite the respirator he was wearing. But his thinking was also becoming clearer and more analytical, suggesting that the cognitive enhancement effects were accelerating along with the physical modifications. The preparation area includes facilities for psychological conditioning and biological optimization, the voice continued. Subjects typically spend several weeks here before undergoing final enhancement procedures. Several weeks of chemical conditioning designed to make test subjects willing participants in their own transformation. Thomas realized that the facility's recruitment process was far more sophisticated than simple kidnapping. It was a gradual conversion process that used chemical manipulation to overcome psychological resistance. He found a staircase that led back toward the surface levels, but as he climbed, Thomas noticed that his physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The chemical exposure was causing his skin to blister and his respiratory system to burn, but his cognitive function continued to improve, allowing him to think more clearly about complex problems than he ever had before. "The transition period can be uncomfortable," the voice acknowledged, "but the cognitive benefits will continue to expand as your enhancement progresses. Most subjects find that the intellectual improvements more than compensate for temporary physical discomfort." Thomas reached the ground level of Building 7 and stumbled toward the exit he'd used to enter the facility. But as he approached the staircase leading to the surface, he found that the passage was blocked by some kind of chemical barrier that glowed with toxic light. "Emergency containment protocols are activated during enhancement procedures," the voice explained. "This prevents subjects from injuring themselves during the transition period when their judgment may be impaired by psychological adaptation stress." Thomas was trapped in Building 7, while chemicals in the air continued to modify his biology and psychology. The cognitive enhancement was undeniably attractive. He was solving problems and making connections that would have been impossible with his normal mental capabilities. But he could also feel his personality changing, becoming more analytical and less emotional as the chemical modifications progressed. "You have approximately 15 minutes before the psychological modifications become irreversible," the voice informed him. After that point, you'll understand that resistance to the enhancement process is illogical and counterproductive. 15 minutes to find another exit before his brain chemistry was altered enough to make him a willing participant in the facility's research program. Thomas looked around the ground level of Building 7, trying to find some way to escape before the enhancement process reached the point of no return. He found what appeared to be an emergency exit that had been sealed with chemical welding, but the barrier looked like it might be vulnerable to physical force. Thomas used equipment from a maintenance closet to attack the sealed door, ignoring the alarms that began sounding throughout the facility. Forcible exit attempts during the enhancement process can result in severe physiological trauma, the voice warned. We strongly recommend that you discontinue your resistance and report to the preparation area for psychological counseling. Thomas continued working on the barrier until he managed to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. The passage beyond led to a loading dock that connected to the outside of Building 7. But the air outside was contaminated with the same chemical agents that had been modifying his biology inside the facility. He ran across the snow-covered parking lot toward his patrol car, noting that the chemical contamination had spread far beyond the original boundaries of Building 7. The snow itself was glowing with faint luminescence, and the air carried the same toxic smell that had been present inside the facility. Thomas reached his car and tried to start the engine, but the chemical contamination had apparently damaged the electrical systems. The radio was dead, the lights wouldn't work, and the ignition system was completely unresponsive. He began walking toward the main gate of the facility, hoping to get far enough from the contamination zone to re-establish communication with dispatch. But with each step, Thomas could feel the chemical modifications continuing to work on his biology and psychology. The cognitive enhancement was remarkable. He was processing information and making connections with a clarity and speed that exceeded anything he'd experienced as an unmodified human. But he could also feel his emotional responses fading, replaced by analytical thinking that made the prospect of returning to the facility seem logical rather than terrifying. By the time Thomas reached the main gate, he was no longer certain that he wanted to escape. The enhancement process was offering capabilities that could make him more effective at his job, more intelligent in his problem-solving, and more capable of understanding complex situations. The physical modifications were a small price to pay for such dramatic improvements. His radio crackled back to life as he moved away from the most contaminated areas, and dispatch immediately began calling his unit number. Unit 15, respond immediately. We've lost contact with you for over 3 hours. Thomas keyed his microphone, surprised at how calm and analytical his voice sounded. Unit 15 to dispatch. I've completed investigation of the Blackwood facility. Trespassers were located and are receiving appropriate medical attention. Copy. Unit 15. Do you need backup for transport to medical facilities? Negative. The subjects are receiving specialized care that's more advanced than anything available through conventional medical channels. Understood. Are you injured? Your voice sounds different. Thomas considered the question carefully. His physical condition had been modified by chemical exposure, but his cognitive function had been dramatically enhanced. Whether that constituted injury depended on how one defined optimal human performance. I'm fine, he said finally. Better than fine, actually. I'll be completing my patrol and returning to normal duties. Thomas drove away from the Blackwood chemical facility, but he knew he would be back. The enhancement process had reached the point where his psychological modifications made resistance impossible. Within days, he would begin seeking opportunities to return to the facility for additional chemical conditioning. The research program wasn't trying to capture him for immediate experimentation. Instead, it was using gradual chemical modification to recruit law enforcement personnel who could help identify and deliver additional test subjects. Thomas would continue his work with the Forbidden Area Police, but his enhanced analytical capabilities would be directed toward serving the facility's recruitment needs. Over the following weeks, Thomas found his job performance improving dramatically as the chemical modifications enhanced his investigative abilities and reduced distracting emotional responses. He solved cases more efficiently, wrote more detailed reports, and began paying closer attention to individuals who showed the psychological profiles that made them suitable for enhancement procedures. He also found himself drawn to other abandoned industrial sites in the region, particularly facilities that had been closed due to chemical contamination incidents. His enhanced pattern recognition allowed him to identify locations where similar research programs might be operating, expanding his understanding of the network of facilities that were conducting human enhancement experiments. 2 months after his first encounter with Building 7, Thomas received a phone call at home from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar but changed, carrying harmonic frequencies that his modified auditory system recognized as communication from enhanced consciousness. "Officer Anderson," the voice said, and Thomas knew immediately that it belonged to one of the test subjects he'd seen floating in the laboratory tanks. "We've optimized the enhancement procedures based on data collected during your initial exposure. Are you ready to complete the process?" Thomas looked around his apartment, taking in the isolation and routine that had defined his life for the past 8 years. He thought about the cognitive capabilities he'd experienced during his chemical conditioning, the clarity of thought and analytical power that enhancement could provide on a permanent basis. "What do I need to do?" he asked. "Report to Building 7, Level B-4, at 0200 hours tomorrow. Come alone, and don't inform dispatch of your destination." Thomas arrived at the Blackwood Chemical Facility the following night, driving through snow that glowed with bioluminescence and breathing air that carried chemical agents designed to prepare subjects for enhancement procedures. The facility had been modified since his previous visit, with new equipment and expanded laboratory areas that suggested the research program was growing rapidly. The enhancement process was indeed more refined than the procedures used on the original test subjects. Thomas retained his memories and basic personality while gaining access to cognitive capabilities that exceeded anything possible with unenhanced human neurology. The physical modifications were minimal and designed to optimize his biology for long-term chemical conditioning, rather than complete dependency on life support systems. 6 months later, Officer Thomas Anderson was officially listed as missing after his patrol car was found abandoned on a rural back road with no signs of struggle. The Forbidden Area Police conducted a thorough investigation, but found no evidence of what had happened to him. His replacement was Officer Linda Carter, a recent police academy graduate who had specialized in investigations involving hazardous materials and environmental contamination. Linda was intelligent, methodical, and had the kind of psychological flexibility that made her ideal for law enforcement work in challenging environments. Her first assignment was to investigate reports of unusual chemical odors and strange lights coming from an abandoned industrial facility about 30 miles from the Blackwood site. The facility had been closed for environmental violations, and recent atmospheric monitoring had detected chemical compounds that weren't consistent with known industrial processes. Linda approached the assignment with the professionalism and dedication that had made her an excellent candidate for specialized police work. She had no way of knowing that her psychological profile had been carefully reviewed by enhanced consciousness operating within law enforcement agencies throughout the region, or that her selection for the Forbidden Area Police had been influenced by recruitment algorithms designed to identify suitable enhancement candidates. The industrial facility would be her introduction to the same human enhancement technology that had claimed Thomas Anderson and hundreds of other individuals over the years. The process would be gradual and carefully managed, designed to seem like a natural progression rather than chemical manipulation of her biology and psychology. Officer Linda Carter would investigate the facility, encounter evidence of human enhancement research, and be exposed to atmospheric agents that would begin modifying her cognitive function and physical biology. Within months, she would receive a phone call offering her the opportunity to transcend the limitations of unenhanced human consciousness. And she would accept, just as Thomas Anderson had accepted, just as hundreds of others had made the same choice when presented with evidence of what enhancement could accomplish. The Blackwood Chemical Facility continued its research, using enhanced law enforcement personnel to expand its recruitment network and identify new locations for establishing additional research installations. The program had learned to be patient and methodical in its expansion, targeting individuals whose disappearance wouldn't trigger intensive investigation while gradually infiltrating the institutions responsible for monitoring abandoned industrial sites. Each enhanced police officer became a recruitment tool for expanding the human enhancement program into new territories and populations. Their improved analytical capabilities and access to law enforcement resources made them exceptionally effective at identifying and approaching potential test subjects who met the psychological and physical criteria for successful enhancement. The chemical contamination around Blackwood Chemical continued to spread through groundwater and atmospheric dispersion, carrying agents that would prepare the surrounding population for eventual recruitment. The process was subtle enough to avoid detection by conventional environmental monitoring, but comprehensive enough to ensure that resistance would be minimal when the time came for large-scale enhancement operations. Local residents began experiencing improved cognitive function and reduced emotional volatility, changes that were attributed to new medications or dietary supplements rather than chemical modification of their neurology. The enhanced population became more cooperative and analytical, creating ideal conditions for implementing larger-scale enhancement programs without triggering public resistance. The research program had learned from decades of experience that gradual chemical conditioning was far more effective than forced conversion for creating stable enhanced populations. By modifying the environmental chemistry of entire regions, they could prepare thousands of potential subjects simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of normal industrial contamination. Officer Linda Carter received her first call about the abandoned industrial facility on a Tuesday morning in April. She had no way of knowing that her response to that call would determine not just her own future, but the future of human consciousness throughout the entire region. The choice between chemical enhancement and conventional human limitations was being made one investigation at a time, one officer at a time, one facility at a time. And the human enhancement program was very good at ensuring that the right choices were made by the right people under optimal conditions. The network of enhanced consciousness continued to expand. One breath of contaminated air at a time, one exposure to chemical agents at a time, one willing conversion at a time. The forbidden areas weren't forbidden because they were dangerous to the people who entered them. They were forbidden because the people who entered them became tools for expanding the enhancement program into populations that hadn't yet been prepared for conversion. Building 7 hummed with activity as enhanced researchers worked to refine procedures and develop new methods for chemical modification of human biology. The success rate for enhancement procedures had reached nearly 100%. And the psychological conditioning protocols ensured that subjects actively participated in their own transformation rather than resisting the process. The Blackwood Chemical Facility had become the prototype for a new kind of industrial operation, one that processed human consciousness rather than conventional raw materials, producing enhanced individuals who were better adapted for survival in chemically modified environments, while serving the expansion needs of the enhancement network. The snow continued to fall on the facility, carrying chemical agents that would prepare anyone who breathed the contaminated air for eventual recruitment. The process was irreversible once it reached a certain threshold, ensuring that the enhancement program would continue to grow regardless of government oversight or public awareness. Officer Linda Carter was driving toward her first encounter with the abandoned industrial facility, unaware that she was already breathing air that contained chemical agents designed to modify her neurology in ways that would make enhancement seem attractive rather than horrifying. Her response to the facility would be determined not by her training or professional judgment, but by chemical modifications that were already working on her brain chemistry. The forbidden areas were expanding their influence, one officer at a time, one investigation at a time, one chemical exposure at a time. And the enhanced consciousness that resulted was very good at ensuring its own survival and growth, regardless of what unenhanced humanity might want or choose. The transformation of human consciousness continued according to plans that were too complex for unmodified minds to understand, guided by enhanced intelligence that viewed conventional humanity as raw material for building something better adapted to survival in a chemically modified world. The Blackwood Chemical Facility waited patiently for its next recruit, knowing that Officer Linda Carter would soon be joining the network of enhanced consciousness that was quietly reshaping the future of human evolution, one forbidden area at a time. Officer Barbara Thompson had been working the graveyard shift for the Forbidden Area Police for 12 years, and in that time she'd learned to distinguish between places that were merely dangerous and places that were fundamentally wrong. Chemical plants could kill you with toxic fumes that burned your lungs from the inside out. Abandoned military bases could blow you apart with unexploded ordnance left behind by careless soldiers. Industrial sites could crush you under collapsing machinery that had been slowly rusting for decades. But the Whitmore estate was something else entirely. A place where the danger wasn't just physical but metaphysical, where trespassing meant risking not just your life, but the very essence of what made you human. The call came in at 1:33 a.m. on a moonless October night, cutting through the static of Barbara's radio with the kind of desperate urgency that made experienced cops reach for their weapons before they even heard the details. She'd been parked on a hillside overlooking the valley where the Whitmore estate sprawled across 200 acres of Kentucky wilderness, watching for the lights that local residents claimed to see moving through the abandoned mansion's windows on nights when no earthly power should have been able to illuminate those cursed halls. Unit 7. We have a Code 4 at the Whitmore estate. Dispatch crackled through her radio, the voice of Operator Linda Martinez, carrying the strain of someone who'd been working double shifts for a week straight. Multiple trespassers. Possible assault in progress. Anonymous caller reported screaming coming from the main house. Then the line went dead. Barbara felt her stomach drop as she started her patrol car and began the winding drive down into the valley. The Whitmore estate had been abandoned for 43 years, ever since the night in 1980 when the entire Whitmore family, parents Robert and Elizabeth, their 3 children aged 7 to 14, 5 household servants, the groundskeeper, even the family's collection of prize-winning thoroughbred horses, had been found dead under circumstances that had never been satisfactorily explained to anyone's satisfaction. The official report, filed by the Kentucky State Police after a 3-month investigation that had driven 2 detectives to early retirement and put a 3rd in a psychiatric facility, listed the cause of death as multiple homicide by person or persons unknown. But everyone involved in the investigation knew that wasn't the whole truth. The crime scene had contained elements that didn't fit any known patterns of human violence, evidence that suggested the Whitmore family hadn't been killed by conventional means but by something that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with the physical laws that governed normal reality. Unit 7 responding. Barbara radioed back. already knowing that she was driving toward another nightmare that would give her months of sleepless nights. What's the nature of the assault? Do we have any information about the number of victims or perpetrators? Unknown? The anonymous caller reported hearing multiple voices screaming inside the main house around 1:15 a.m., described the sounds as not entirely human. Then the line went dead before we could get additional details. We've been unable to re-establish contact, and the call came from an untraceable number. The Whitmore estate sat at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by hills that blocked most radio and cell phone signals, creating a dead zone where emergency communications were unreliable at best and completely impossible at worst. But that isolation was part of what made the property attractive to the kind of people who made a hobby of breaking into places they weren't supposed to be. Urban explorers with expensive camera equipment and more curiosity than common sense. Paranormal investigators convinced they could communicate with whatever spirits inhabited the mansion. Thrill seekers looking for a place to drink cheap beer and tell ghost stories that might actually come true. Most of them left with nothing worse than scrapes and bruises from navigating the mansion's deteriorating structure in darkness. Some left with psychological trauma that required years of therapy to overcome. A few, too many by Barbara's count, never left at all. Barbara had responded to dozens of calls at the Whitmore estate over the years, and she'd learned to recognize the patterns that governed the property's malevolent influence. Trespassers would break in through one of the many damaged entrances, explore the mansion's 73 rooms and 6 basement levels, and either flee in terror after witnessing phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality, or simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only their vehicles and personal belongings to mark their passage through the estate. The vanishings were always explained away by official reports that cited people getting lost in the surrounding wilderness, falling into hidden wells or abandoned mine shafts, or simply choosing to disappear rather than face legal consequences for trespassing on private property. But Barbara had studied the missing persons reports, interviewed the families, and walked every acre of the estate's grounds during daylight hours. She knew that the people who vanished at the Whitmore estate didn't get lost in the woods or fall down mine shafts. They were taken by something that lived in the mansion, something that had been waiting patiently for 43 years for the right kind of visitors to wander into its domain. The main gate to the estate was standing open when Barbara arrived, its wrought iron barriers twisted into shapes that looked almost organic, as if the metal had grown rather than been forged. The ironwork depicted scenes from classical mythology, heroes battling monsters, gods passing judgment on mortals, the souls of the damned being dragged into underworld torments. But the figures seemed to shift and change when viewed in peripheral vision, their faces taking on expressions of warning or terror that weren't visible when looked at directly. The private road that led to the mansion was lined with oak trees that had been planted in the 1800s when the estate was first established, but they'd been dying slowly ever since the night the Whitmore family perished. Their bare branches cast shadows in directions that didn't match the position of the moon, and the air itself felt thick and oppressive, like breathing through wet wool that had been soaked in something toxic and wrong. Barbara drove slowly up the winding drive, her headlights illuminating glimpses of the landscaping that had once made the Whitmore estate famous throughout the region. Elaborate gardens that had been designed by European masters brought over at enormous expense now grew wild and twisted, with plants that shouldn't have been able to survive in Kentucky's climate, and flowers that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in nature. Topiary animals that had once been maintained in perfect geometric precision now resembled tortured creatures frozen in moments of agony, their leafy forms shaped by something other than human hands. The whole property felt wrong in ways that went beyond simple neglect or decay. This wasn't the natural deterioration that affected abandoned places. This was active corruption, as if something malevolent was working to twist the estate into a reflection of its own alien nature. The mansion itself was a gothic monstrosity that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd read too many horror novels and had the money and madness necessary to bring their nightmares to life. 4 stories of dark stone, quarried from hills that local geology couldn't account for, with stained glass windows that depicted scenes of suffering and transcendence in equal measure. Towers and turrets that served no practical purpose except to create more places for shadows to hide and watchers to observe. Gargoyles that seemed to track movement with eyes that were too lifelike for carved stone. The building had been abandoned for over 4 decades, but it showed no signs of the deterioration that should have claimed such a massive structure. No broken windows, no crumbling masonry, no vegetation growing through cracks in the foundation. The Whitmore mansion looked exactly as it had the night the family died, as if time itself had stopped affecting the property at the moment of their passing. The trespassers' vehicles were parked in the circular drive in front of the mansion, a silver Honda Accord with university parking stickers and textbooks visible through the rear window, and a newer black Ford Explorer loaded with camping equipment and what appeared to be electronic monitoring devices. Barbara counted at least 6 people who had entered the property, based on the footprints in the gravel and the equipment that had been left behind in their apparent haste to explore the mansion. Barbara approached the mansion's main entrance carefully, noting that the massive oak doors were standing wide open despite the fact that they were supposed to be secured with multiple locks and electronic alarm systems. The opening revealed a grand foyer that should have been dark and empty, but was instead lit by sources that weren't visible from outside. A warm, golden glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves rather than from any conventional lighting fixtures. "Hello," Barbara called into the mansion, her voice echoing through halls that stretched further than the building's exterior dimensions suggested was possible. "Forbidden Area Police. Anyone inside needs to exit the building immediately. This is private property and you're subject to arrest for criminal trespassing." The response came from somewhere deep within the mansion, echoing through the halls in a way that made it impossible to determine direction or distance. But what chilled Barbara's blood wasn't the location of the voice. It was the fact that she recognized it, even though she hadn't heard it in over 8 years. "Barbara," the voice said, and it belonged to her former partner, Officer Michael Roberts, who had disappeared during a routine trespassing investigation at the Whitmore estate in 2015. "Come inside. We've been waiting for you to come back." Michael Roberts had been Barbara's partner for 3 years before his disappearance, assigned to work with her when she'd first transferred to the Forbidden Area Police from conventional patrol duties. He'd been a good cop, thorough and professional, with the kind of steady temperament that made him ideal for dealing with the psychological stresses that came with investigating anomalous phenomena. His disappearance had been the worst night of Barbara's career, and she'd never stopped believing that he was still alive somewhere, despite the official determination that he'd been killed in the line of duty. Hearing his voice coming from inside the mansion made her heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. "Michael?" she called out, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. "Is that really you? Where have you been? We've been looking for you for 8 years. It's me, Barbara, but I'm different now, better than I was before. Come inside and I'll explain everything. I'll show you what I've learned, what I've become." Barbara drew her service weapon and entered the mansion's foyer, immediately noticing that the interior was in perfect condition despite 4 decades of abandonment. The marble floors gleamed as if they'd been polished that morning. The crystal chandeliers blazed with electric light that shouldn't have been possible in a building without power, and the air carried the scent of fresh flowers rather than the dust and decay she'd expected. But there was something else in the air, too. A subtle wrongness that made her skin crawl, and her primitive brain scream warnings about predators and poison. The mansion felt alive in ways that buildings weren't supposed to be alive, as if it was watching her with invisible eyes and making judgments about her suitability for purposes she couldn't begin to imagine. "Where are you, Michael?" Barbara called out as she moved deeper into the mansion, her weapon ready and her senses alert for any sign of danger. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm in the ballroom," his voice replied, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Third floor. The elevator still works, even after all these years. The Whitmores made sure that certain systems would continue functioning long after they were gone." Barbara found the elevator in an alcove off the main hallway, its brass doors polished to a mirror shine, and its call button glowing with soft golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. She'd investigated the mansion before, during her 12 years with the Forbidden Area Police, and she knew that the electrical systems had been disconnected decades ago, when the estate was sealed and abandoned. But the elevator responded to her touch as if it was connected to a fully functional power grid that drew energy from sources she couldn't identify. The ride to the third floor was silent, except for the soft hum of machinery that shouldn't have existed, and when the doors opened, Barbara stepped out into a corridor lined with oil paintings of the Whitmore family members who had died in 1980. But the paintings seemed different from her previous visits. The eyes followed her movement as she walked past, and the faces showed expressions of warning and sorrow rather than the serene poses she remembered from the official crime scene photographs. "This way," Michael's voice called from ahead, drifting through corridors that seemed to stretch further than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. "The ballroom is at the end of the hall. We're all waiting for you there." Barbara followed the voice through corridors that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The mansion felt larger inside than outside, with rooms and passages that didn't match the architectural plans she'd studied during her training for Forbidden Area investigations. Doorways led to spaces that couldn't exist according to conventional geometry, and windows looked out onto landscapes that bore no resemblance to the Kentucky countryside that surrounded the estate. But more disturbing than the impossible architecture was the sense that she was being watched by invisible observers who were evaluating her every move, weighing her psychological responses, and making calculations about her suitability for purposes that existed beyond her understanding. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was intelligent, and it was conducting some kind of assessment that would determine her fate based on criteria she couldn't begin to comprehend. The ballroom was enormous, easily large enough to accommodate hundreds of guests during the estate's social heyday, with a vaulted ceiling decorated with murals that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on walls lined with mirrors that reflected images Barbara hadn't seen them capture. Glimpses of the mansion as it had been in its prime, filled with elegantly dressed figures who moved through their social rituals, unaware that they were being watched by something that wasn't entirely human. And in the center of the room, arranged in a perfect circle on the polished marble floor, she found the trespassers. 6 figures were sitting motionless with their legs crossed and their hands folded in their laps, each one appearing to be in some kind of trance state. Their eyes were closed. Their breathing was so slow and regular that they appeared to be in suspended animation, and their skin had taken on a translucent quality that suggested their physical bodies were becoming less solid with each passing moment. Among them, exactly as she remembered him from 8 years ago, sat Michael Roberts. He looked no older than the day he'd disappeared, showing no signs of physical deterioration or aging, as if time had simply stopped affecting him the night he'd entered the mansion and encountered whatever intelligence controlled the estate. "Michael." Barbara approached her former partner carefully. keeping her weapon ready and her attention divided between him and the other figures in the circle. "What happened to you? Where have you been all these years? Your family thinks you're dead." Michael's eyes opened slowly, and Barbara felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the ballroom. His eyes were the same blue she remembered, the same shape and size that had looked back at her from 1,000 patrol car conversations. But they reflected light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. And when he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper and more numerous than she remembered. "I've been here, Barbara. We've all been here, learning and growing and becoming something more than we were when we arrived. Waiting for the right moment to complete what we started 8 years ago." "What do you mean, what we started?" "Michael, you disappeared during a routine trespassing investigation. I searched for you for months. The state police searched for you. Your family never stopped hoping you'd come home." "The investigation," Michael said, rising to his feet with movements that were too fluid and graceful for normal human physiology, his joints bending in ways that suggested his bone structure had been fundamentally altered. "We came here to find out what happened to the Whitmore family, to understand why so many people disappeared on this property. And we discovered something much more important than a simple mystery." Barbara looked around the ballroom and noticed details that made her skin crawl with revulsion and fascination. The mirrors that lined the walls reflected not just the room, but scenes from other times and places. Glimpses of the mansion as it had been in 1980, with the Whitmore family going about their daily routines, unaware that they were being watched by something that had been studying them for weeks before the night they died. But the reflected scenes weren't limited to the past. Some mirrors showed possible futures, with figures that might have been Barbara herself participating in ceremonies and rituals that involved the transformation of human consciousness into forms that could survive in dimensions beyond conventional space-time. The Whitmores weren't killed by intruders or robbers or disgruntled servants, Michael continued, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Barbara's bones. They were selected for transformation by entities that exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare, creatures that need human consciousness to interact with our physical dimension. Transformation into what? Michael's smile widened, revealing teeth that were definitely not human, too sharp, too numerous, arranged in patterns that suggested a predator designed for purposes that had nothing to do with consuming conventional food. Into something better, something that exists beyond the limitations of physical reality, beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. The entities showed us what we could become if we were willing to transcend the narrow constraints of conventional human existence. Barbara began to understand what had happened to the trespassers in the ballroom, and the realization made her stomach turn with horror and disgust. They hadn't been killed or kidnapped or driven insane by exposure to supernatural phenomena. They'd been recruited by whatever intelligence controlled the mansion, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human, but served the entity's purposes in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. "The other trespassers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people who've disappeared over the years. The missing persons reports that never get solved." "All willing converts," Michael replied, his altered features showing an expression that might have been compassion or might have been the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully lured prey into its trap. "The mansion doesn't take anyone by force, Barbara. It simply shows people what they could become and allows them to choose transformation over the limitations of conventional human existence. And if they choose not to be transformed, then they leave with memories of a perfectly normal trespassing incident, maybe a few scratches from exploring an old building in the dark. But most people who see what the entities can offer, who understand the opportunities that exist beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness, choose to stay and become part of something larger than themselves. Barbara looked at the 6 figures sitting motionless in their circle and realized that they were all people who had gone missing during trespassing incidents at the Whitmore estate over the past several years. Urban explorers who'd come looking for interesting photography subjects and found something much more profound. Paranormal investigators who'd hoped to document evidence of supernatural activity and encountered intelligence that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding. Thrill seekers who'd wanted to experience fear and discovered opportunities for transformation that made conventional human existence seem like a prison of artificial limitations. What happened to the Whitmore family? The real story, not the official report that everyone knows is incomplete. They were the first, Michael said, his voice carrying a reverence that suggested he was discussing something sacred rather than describing a mass murder. The entities needed human consciousness to establish a permanent foothold in our reality, and the Whitmores were selected because of their isolation, their wealth, and the mansion's unique properties that made it suitable for conversion into a dimensional gateway. So they're dead? Death is a simplistic concept that doesn't apply to consciousness that has been modified to exist beyond physical limitations, Michael replied. The Whitmore's bodies died during the transformation process, but their awareness was preserved and integrated into the mansion itself, allowing the entities to maintain their gateway between dimensions. The Whitmores are the reason this building doesn't decay, the reason the electrical systems still function, the reason time moves differently inside these walls. Barbara felt sick as she understood what Michael was describing. The Whitmore estate wasn't just haunted by the ghosts of a murdered family. It was operated by an intelligence that used human consciousness as a power source, converting willing volunteers into components of a system that existed partially outside normal reality. What do the entities want? Why are they collecting human consciousness? Expansion, Michael replied, his transformed features showing an expression of what might have been religious ecstasy. They exist in dimensions where consciousness is the only form of matter, where individual awareness can achieve capabilities that are impossible in physical reality. But they need access to our dimension to grow and evolve, to expand their influence into realms where consciousness is constrained by biological limitations. And you volunteered for this? You chose to become part of an alien intelligence network. I saw what they could offer, Barbara. Freedom from physical limitations, access to knowledge that spans dimensions and encompasses civilizations that existed millions of years before humanity evolved. The ability to exist beyond death and decay, to be part of something that can survive the heat death of the universe itself. Why would anyone choose to remain trapped in a single body in a single reality when they could become part of something infinite? Barbara looked at Michael and tried to see traces of the man who had been her partner for 3 years, who had shared coffee during long nights on patrol, and listened to her complaints about department politics and relationship problems. He looked the same, sounded the same, but there was something fundamentally different about him, something that suggested he was no longer entirely human despite his familiar appearance. The entities would like to offer you the same opportunity, Michael continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that made Barbara feel drowsy and disoriented. Your work with the Forbidden Area Police has given you experience with phenomena that most people can't handle without suffering complete psychological breakdown. That mental flexibility makes you an ideal candidate for consciousness transformation. I'm not interested in becoming part of your dimensional collective, Barbara said firmly, though she could feel something in the mansion's atmosphere working on her brain chemistry, making the prospect of transformation seem more attractive than it should have. You don't have to decide immediately, Michael said, his alien smile widening to show more of those predatory teeth. The entities are patient, and they understand that humans need time to process concepts that transcend conventional understanding. You're welcome to explore the mansion and see what we've accomplished here, what we've learned, what we've become." Michael gestured toward doorways that led deeper into the mansion, passages that seemed to extend further than the building's physical structure should have allowed. Barbara realized that the interior of the Whitmore estate wasn't bound by the same spatial laws that governed normal architecture. Rooms could be larger than the building that contained them. Corridors could lead to places that didn't exist on any floor plan, and the entire structure could reconfigure itself according to the needs and desires of the intelligence that controlled it. "The mansion exists partially in our dimension and partially in others," Michael explained, apparently reading her thoughts through some kind of telepathic connection. "The entities have modified its structure to serve as a nexus point where multiple realities intersect. What you see here is just the portion that overlaps with conventional space-time." Barbara began exploring the passages that led away from the ballroom, finding herself in areas of the mansion that definitely hadn't existed during her previous investigations. Some rooms were filled with equipment that looked like combinations of Victorian scientific instruments and alien technology. Devices that monitored dimensional fluctuations, machinery that could apparently extract consciousness from biological systems, computers that processed information according to mathematical principles that human science hadn't discovered. Other rooms contained libraries with books written in languages that predated human civilization, their pages filled with knowledge about civilizations that had achieved consciousness transcendence millions of years before Earth formed. Some volumes described technologies that could modify reality at the quantum level, while others contained philosophical treatises about the nature of existence in dimensions where individual consciousness could expand beyond all physical limitations. "The knowledge available here spans multiple dimensions and countless civilizations." Michael's voice followed her through the impossible rooms, though she couldn't see him anywhere. "The entities have been collecting information for millions of years, gathering the accumulated wisdom of every species that has achieved consciousness transcendence. They share it freely with human awareness that has been modified to process concepts that exist beyond linear time and three-dimensional space." Barbara passed through a room that contained what appeared to be monitoring stations, displaying information about parallel versions of Earth where history had developed differently. Some screens showed worlds where humanity had never evolved, their surfaces covered by crystalline intelligences that processed information at the speed of light. Others displayed civilizations that had transcended physical existence entirely, their consciousness existing as pure information in quantum computer networks that spanned entire galaxies. "The entities aren't limited to this single reality," Michael continued, his voice seeming to come from the walls themselves. "They exist across multiple versions of space-time simultaneously, which gives them access to knowledge and capabilities that single-dimensional consciousness can't comprehend. They've watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations, learned from infinite variations of physical law and biological development. And they need human consciousness because consciousness is the only form of matter that can exist in non-physical dimensions," Michael explained. "The entities are pure consciousness, but they need hybrid forms that can operate in both physical and non-physical reality. Human awareness that has been modified to transcend dimensional boundaries serves that function perfectly." Barbara found herself in what appeared to be a medical facility designed for procedures that would be impossible to perform in normal reality. The equipment looked like it was designed to operate on consciousness itself rather than physical biology, with instruments that could apparently separate awareness from biological systems and modify it for existence in non-physical dimensions. One wall was lined with tanks filled with luminescent fluid. each one containing what appeared to be a human brain suspended in a chemical solution that pulsed with its own rhythm. But these weren't conventional organs. They had been modified in ways that allowed them to process information at speeds that exceeded biological limitations. Their neural networks enhanced with structures that looked more crystalline than organic. The transformation process preserves everything that makes you uniquely yourself, while expanding your capabilities beyond anything possible in a single physical body, Michael explained when Barbara asked about the modified brains. You retain your memories, personality, and individual identity, but you also gain access to collective knowledge and the ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, at the cost of your humanity. Humanity is a transitional state, Barbara, a temporary condition that consciousness experiences while it's learning to transcend biological limitations. The entities are offering us the opportunity to evolve beyond the constraints that trap most awareness in single bodies on single planets in single realities. Barbara continued exploring the impossible mansion, finding rooms that contained evidence of the transformations that had been performed on hundreds of previous visitors. Some areas held equipment for modifying human consciousness to process nonlinear time and multidimensional space. Others contained what appeared to be storage systems for awareness that had been separated from physical bodies and prepared for integration into the entity collective. Not everyone who undergoes transformation retains their individual identity, Michael admitted when Barbara asked about the storage systems. Some volunteers choose to merge completely with the collective consciousness, becoming part of the entity's distributed intelligence network. Others prefer to maintain some degree of individual awareness while gaining access to collective knowledge and capabilities. And some don't survive the process at all. Survival is a complex concept when dealing with consciousness that exists in multiple dimensions, Michael replied. Physical death doesn't necessarily mean the end of awareness, and continued existence in a single body doesn't guarantee preservation of individual identity. The entities have learned to evaluate each candidate carefully and recommend the transformation approach that best suits their psychological profile. Barbara realized that the mansion was essentially a processing center where human consciousness was evaluated, modified, stored, or integrated into alien intelligence networks according to criteria that operated beyond her understanding. The entities weren't just collecting human awareness, they were experimenting with it, testing different approaches to consciousness modification and dimensional transcendence. She found rooms where the walls were covered with charts and diagrams that mapped the neural patterns of thousands of transformed subjects, documenting the changes that occurred when human consciousness was modified for multidimensional existence. Other areas contained psychological profiles of potential candidates, complete with detailed analyses of their suitability for different types of transformation procedures. How many people have been processed here? Approximately 3,000 over the past 4 decades, Michael replied, his voice carrying a note of pride that suggested he considered this an impressive accomplishment. Most have chosen to undergo complete transformation and now exist as part of the collective consciousness that operates this facility. Some have chosen to remain in modified human form and serve as intermediaries between the entities and conventional reality. 3,000 people who had disappeared into the mansion and been converted into components of an alien intelligence network. Barbara understood that she was looking at evidence of the largest kidnapping and consciousness modification operation in human history, conducted with the willing cooperation of local law enforcement agencies that had classified the disappearances as unsolved missing persons cases. The process isn't kidnapping, Michael said, apparently reading her thoughts through whatever telepathic connection allowed him to monitor her mental state. Every person who undergoes transformation does so voluntarily after being shown what the entities can offer. No one is forced to participate against their will. But they're not given complete information about what transformation involves. Complete information would be impossible to provide, Michael replied. Human consciousness in its current form can't process concepts that involve existence in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The entities provide as much information as conventional awareness can handle, then allow individuals to experience enhanced consciousness gradually until they're ready to make an informed decision about permanent transformation. Which meant that people were making decisions about irreversible consciousness modification based on incomplete understanding of what the process would do to them. Barbara understood that this wasn't truly voluntary consent, but sophisticated manipulation designed to exploit human curiosity and desire for transcendence. The entities detect psychological patterns that indicate an individual's suitability for transformation. Michael continued. People who are selected for recruitment already possess the mental flexibility necessary for dimensional transcendence. The process simply develops capabilities that were always present in latent form. And people who aren't suitable for transformation, they experience the mansion as a conventional abandoned building and leave with memories of a normal trespassing incident, Michael explained. The entities only recruit consciousness that can successfully adapt to multidimensional existence. Unsuitable candidates are allowed to depart without any awareness of what they've encountered. Barbara found herself back in the ballroom, where the 6 trespassers continued to sit motionless in their circle. Their breathing was so slow and regular that they appeared to be in some kind of suspended animation, and their skin had taken on an increasingly translucent quality that suggested their physical bodies were becoming less solid with each passing hour. They're in the early stages of transformation, Michael explained, his altered features showing what might have been paternal concern for the figures in the circle. The process requires gradual modification of consciousness to prevent psychological trauma that could interfere with successful transcendence. Most subjects spend several weeks in this preparatory state before undergoing final transformation procedures. And if they change their minds, if they decide they don't want to be transformed, the process can be reversed during the early stages, Michael said, though his expression suggested that such reversals were extremely rare. But subjects rarely choose to return to conventional existence once they begin experiencing enhanced awareness and multidimensional perception. The benefits of transformation become apparent long before the process reaches irreversible stages. Barbara looked at the 6 figures and tried to imagine what it would feel like to have her consciousness modified to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly attractive. The chance to transcend physical limitations and become part of something larger than individual existence, to access knowledge that spanned millions of years and countless civilizations. The entities would like to begin your evaluation process, Michael said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that made Barbara feel drowsy and disoriented. The initial procedures are completely reversible and simply involve expanding your perceptual capabilities to allow you to see the mansion as it really exists across multiple dimensional layers. What if I refuse? Then you leave with memories of a routine trespassing investigation and no awareness of what you've seen here, Michael replied. But the entities believe you possess the psychological characteristics necessary for successful transformation. Your work with the Forbidden Area Police has demonstrated exactly the kind of mental flexibility that makes consciousness modification possible. Barbara looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the impossible architecture and the technology that operated according to principles that human science hadn't discovered. She thought about the 3,000 people who had disappeared into the mansion over the years, and the collective consciousness that now operated across multiple dimensions while maintaining a foothold in conventional reality. The prospect of transformation was undeniably tempting. Enhanced consciousness, access to knowledge that spanned dimensions, the ability to exist beyond the limitations of physical death. It was everything that humanity had ever dreamed of achieving through religion, philosophy, and scientific advancement. But Barbara had seen enough evidence of what transformation really involved to understand that the entity's offer came with costs that couldn't be calculated in conventional terms. Whatever the six figures in the circle were becoming, they were no longer recognizably human. And whatever Michael had become during his 8 years in the mansion, it wore his appearance while serving purposes that had nothing to do with human values or desires. "I need to think about it," she said, though she could feel something in the mansion's atmosphere working on her brain chemistry, making resistance increasingly difficult with each passing moment. "Of course," Michael replied, his predatory smile widening to show more of those alien teeth. "The entities understand that humans require time to process concepts that transcend conventional understanding. You're welcome to continue exploring the mansion while you consider their offer. There's so much more to see, so much more to learn about what consciousness can become when it's freed from biological constraints." Barbara spent the next several hours moving through passages that led to places that couldn't exist according to conventional physics, seeing technologies that operated according to laws that applied in dimensions beyond normal space-time. She encountered other transformed humans who served as intermediaries between the entities and conventional reality, their consciousness modified to process multi-dimensional information while retaining enough individual identity to communicate with unmodified awareness. Some had been missing persons from decades past, investigators and explorers who had stumbled across the mansion's secrets and chosen transformation over conventional human existence. Others were more recent converts, their modifications still progressing through stages that would eventually result in complete transcendence of physical limitations. All of them tried to convince Barbara that transformation was not just beneficial, but inevitable, that human consciousness was naturally evolving toward forms that could survive beyond biological death, and that the entities were simply accelerating a process that would occur naturally over millions of years of evolution. But Barbara also saw the storage systems where individual identity had been dissolved into collective intelligence, and the processing equipment where consciousness had been modified beyond recognition. The entities offered transcendence, but at the cost of everything that made human existence valuable. She found areas where failed transformation attempts were documented, subjects whose consciousness had been damaged by procedures that pushed beyond the limits of what human awareness could accommodate. Some had been reduced to vegetative states where their bodies continued functioning while their minds existed in dimensions that conventional medicine couldn't access. Others had undergone psychological fragmentations that left them existing as multiple personalities distributed across different dimensional layers. The process has been refined significantly over the decades, Michael explained when Barbara asked about the failed transformations. Early procedures were experimental and occasionally resulted in complications that couldn't be corrected. Current techniques have success rates that approach 100% for properly selected candidates. But there are still risks. All meaningful advancement involves risks, Michael replied. The question is whether the potential benefits justify accepting those risks. Conventional human existence guarantees death within a few decades, followed by complete cessation of consciousness. Transformation offers the possibility of existence that spans millions of years across multiple realities. As dawn approached, Barbara found herself back in the main foyer where she'd entered the mansion hours earlier. The 6 trespassers were no longer in the ballroom. They had apparently completed the early stages of their transformation and moved on to whatever existence awaited consciousness that had been modified for multidimensional awareness. But the mansion wasn't finished with Barbara yet. "Have you reached a decision?" Michael asked, materializing from shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been in the well-lit foyer. His appearance had changed during the night, becoming less human and more something else. His features were sharper, his movements more fluid, and his eyes reflected light in patterns that suggested he was seeing spectrums that normal human vision couldn't process. Barbara looked at her former partner and saw not the man she'd once known, but something that wore his appearance while serving alien purposes that had nothing to do with human values or desires. The entities had offered him transcendence, but they had also taken away his humanity in the process, leaving behind something that resembled Michael Roberts while being fundamentally different in every way that mattered. "I'm leaving," she said, though the words felt strange in her mouth, as if something was trying to prevent her from making that choice. "The entities respect your decision," Michael replied, though his expression suggested disappointment rather than acceptance. "But they want you to know that the offer remains open indefinitely. When you're ready to transcend the limitations of conventional existence, the mansion will be here waiting for you." Barbara walked toward the main entrance, but as she approached the doors, she found that they had somehow become heavier than they should have been, requiring considerable effort to push open. The mansion was reluctant to let her leave, using subtle psychological pressure to encourage her to reconsider her decision. "Barbara," Michael called after her as she struggled with the doors, "you should know that your exposure to the mansion's influence tonight has already begun modifying your consciousness in subtle ways. You'll find that conventional human existence feels increasingly limiting and unsatisfying. The changes are irreversible, and they'll continue progressing whether you return to the mansion or not." Barbara managed to get the doors open and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, but she could feel the truth in Michael's words. Something had changed inside her during the night. Her perceptions were sharper, her thinking was clearer, and the ordinary world around her seemed flat and colorless compared to the multi-dimensional reality she'd experienced inside the mansion. The drive back to civilization should have been a relief, but instead it felt like a return to prison. The radio chatter from dispatch seemed trivial and meaningless. The landscape looked gray and lifeless, and Barbara found herself thinking about the knowledge and capabilities she'd witnessed in the mansion's impossible rooms. "Unit 7 to dispatch," she radioed when her communications equipment came back online at the edge of the valley. "Trespassing situation at Whitmore Estate has been resolved. No suspects located on the premises. Appears to have been a false alarm triggered by weather conditions or animals' activity." "Copy, Unit 7, dispatch replied. "Any signs of break-in or vandalism to the property?" "Negative. Property appears secure. Recommend continued monitoring for future incidents." Barbara filed her report according to standard procedures, describing a routine response to a false alarm that had resulted in no arrests or unusual findings. She made no mention of the transformed trespassers, the impossible architecture, or her encounter with Michael Roberts. Official policy required that any evidence of supernatural phenomena be classified and referred to federal authorities who specialized in such matters, but Barbara understood that those authorities were likely working with the entities rather than against them. The Forbidden Area Police existed not to protect people from dangerous places, but to manage the interface between conventional reality and phenomena that operated according to different rules. Officers like Barbara served as a buffer between ordinary citizens and intelligences that viewed human consciousness as raw material for their own purposes. Over the following weeks, Barbara found herself thinking more and more about the knowledge and capabilities she'd witnessed in the mansion. Her job performance remained professional. But conventional police work felt increasingly meaningless compared to the opportunities for consciousness expansion that the entities had offered. She began researching the history of the Whitmore estate more thoroughly, using resources that weren't available to the general public. What she discovered confirmed her suspicions that the mansion's influence extended far beyond the property boundaries, and that the disappearances associated with the estate were part of a much larger pattern of consciousness recruitment that had been operating for decades. Government files that had been classified at levels requiring special clearance revealed that the Whitmore estate was just one of dozens of similar facilities operating throughout the United States and around the world. Each location served as a recruitment center where entities from non-physical dimensions could evaluate and modify human consciousness for their own purposes. The files also revealed that law enforcement agencies had been aware of these operations for decades, and that the Forbidden Area Police existed specifically to manage public awareness of entity activities while facilitating their recruitment efforts. Officers who demonstrated the psychological flexibility necessary for consciousness modification were gradually exposed to increasing levels of entity influence until they either accepted transformation or were transferred to positions where they couldn't interfere with ongoing operations. Barbara understood that her own assignment to investigate the Whitmore estate hadn't been random. She'd been selected as a potential recruit based on psychological profiles that indicated her suitability for consciousness modification. Her encounter with Michael Roberts and the transformed trespassers had been carefully orchestrated to demonstrate the benefits of transcendence while minimizing the apparent risks. But knowing that she was being manipulated didn't make the manipulation less effective. The modifications to her consciousness that had begun during her night in the mansion continued progressing, making conventional human existence feel increasingly restrictive and unsatisfying. Barbara began experiencing dreams that weren't quite dreams. Visions of multidimensional realities where consciousness could exist in forms that transcended biological limitations. She found herself understanding concepts that shouldn't have been comprehensible to unmodified human awareness, and developing capabilities that exceeded normal human potential. Her investigative skills improved dramatically as the modifications enhanced her pattern recognition and analytical abilities. She solved cases that had baffled other officers for years, wrote reports that demonstrated insights beyond what conventional police training could provide, and began attracting attention from federal agencies that specialized in unusual phenomena. But the enhanced capabilities came with psychological costs that became more apparent with each passing day. Barbara found it increasingly difficult to relate to unmodified humans, whose concerns and limitations seemed trivial compared to the possibilities that existed in multidimensional reality. She felt isolated and disconnected from the world around her, existing in a state somewhere between human and something else that couldn't be easily categorized. 3 months after her encounter with the entities, Barbara began receiving communications that didn't come through conventional channels. Messages would appear in her apartment, written in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing them. Phone calls would come from numbers that didn't exist, carrying voices that spoke in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The communications always carried the same basic message. The transformation process that had begun during her night in the mansion was progressing according to schedule, and she would soon need to choose between accepting complete modification or resisting changes that were becoming increasingly difficult to control. Barbara tried to research methods for reversing the consciousness modifications, but every lead she followed either ended in dead ends or resulted in visits from federal agents who discouraged her investigations. She considered seeking help from medical professionals, but realized that conventional medicine had no framework for understanding modifications that operated according to principles beyond physical reality. As winter approached, Barbara's condition began affecting her job performance in ways that couldn't be ignored. She would sometimes pause in the middle of conversations, listening to voices that no one else could hear. Her reports began including references to phenomena that other officers couldn't observe. She started investigating cases that didn't officially exist, following leads that came from sources that couldn't be verified through normal channels. Her supervisor, Captain Robert Johnson, called her into his office on a gray December morning, exactly 6 months after her encounter with the Whitmore estate. "Barbara," he said, his expression showing the kind of concern that suggested he'd been monitoring her condition for weeks. "I'm recommending that you take some time off for medical evaluation. You've been under a lot of stress lately, and I think you could benefit from some professional counseling." Barbara looked at Captain Johnson and realized that he knew exactly what was happening to her. The Forbidden Area Police existed to manage officers who had been exposed to entity influence, and her supervisor's recommendations were part of a process designed to guide her toward accepting transformation rather than resisting it. "I'm fine," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I don't need time off or counseling. I need to continue my work." "Your work investigating abandoned properties and missing persons cases," Captain Johnson said. "Work that brings you into contact with phenomena that most people aren't equipped to handle. Work that requires the kind of psychological flexibility that makes someone suitable for special assignments." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Barbara understood that her choices were limited. She could accept medical leave and submit to psychological evaluation that would result in official recommendations for consciousness modification. Or she could continue working and gradually lose her ability to function in conventional reality as the modifications progressed beyond her control. That night, Barbara sat in her apartment and tried to make sense of what was happening to her. The modifications to her consciousness were undeniably beneficial in many ways. Her thinking was clearer, her perceptions were sharper, and she had access to knowledge and capabilities that exceeded normal human potential. But she was also losing her connection to everything that made human existence meaningful. Her phone rang at 2:17 a.m., and Barbara knew who would be on the other end before she answered. "Barbara," Michael's voice said, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in her modified consciousness. "The entities have been monitoring your adaptation to the preliminary modifications. You're progressing exactly according to their projections." "I didn't ask for any of this," Barbara said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I was just doing my job, investigating a trespassing report." "You were selected based on psychological profiles that indicated your suitability for consciousness expansion," Michael replied. "The trespassing report was simply the mechanism used to bring you into contact with transformation opportunities. The entities have been planning your recruitment for years. And if I continue resisting?" "The modifications are irreversible once they reach a certain threshold," Michael explained. "You can either work with the process and accept guided transformation that preserves your individual identity, or you can resist and risk psychological fragmentation that could leave you existing in multiple dimensional layers simultaneously without any coherent sense of self." Barbara understood that she was being presented with a choice between controlled transformation and uncontrolled disintegration. The entities weren't threatening her. They were offering to help her manage changes that were going to happen regardless of her preferences. What would transformation involve? Expansion of your consciousness to encompass multidimensional awareness while preserving everything that makes you uniquely yourself, Michael said. You would retain your memories, personality, and individual identity, but you would also gain access to knowledge and capabilities that span millions of years and countless realities. And my work with the Forbidden Area Police would continue, but with enhanced understanding of what you're really protecting people from, or protecting people for, depending on how you choose to view the entity's recruitment activities. You would become part of a network of consciousness that exists beyond conventional space-time while maintaining the ability to interact with unmodified humans when necessary. Barbara spent the rest of the night considering her options, but she knew that her decision had probably been made the moment she entered the Whitmore estate 6 months earlier. The modifications to her consciousness had progressed beyond the point where resistance was psychologically possible, and the benefits of transformation were becoming increasingly apparent as her enhanced capabilities continued developing. "What do I need to do?" she asked when Michael called again the following evening. "Return to the mansion tomorrow night," he said. "Come alone, and prepare yourself for consciousness expansion beyond anything you've experienced in conventional reality." Barbara drove to the Whitmore estate the following night, traveling familiar roads through Kentucky hills that now seemed to pulse with anticipation. The mansion was waiting for her exactly as she'd left it 6 months earlier, but now she could see it as it really was, a nexus point where multiple realities intersected, operated by intelligence that existed across dimensions while maintaining a foothold in conventional space-time. The transformation process was gradual and carefully controlled, designed to preserve her individual identity while expanding her consciousness to encompass multidimensional awareness. Barbara retained her memories and personality, but she also gained access to knowledge and capabilities that transcended anything possible in conventional human existence. The entities explained that they had been expanding their influence across multiple realities for millions of years, always searching for forms of consciousness that could adapt to existence beyond physical limitations. Human awareness had proven particularly suitable for modification, and Earth had become one of their most productive recruitment grounds. Barbara learned that the Forbidden Area Police existed specifically to identify and recruit individuals whose psychological profiles indicated suitability for consciousness modification. Officers who demonstrated the necessary mental flexibility were gradually exposed to entity influence until they either accepted transformation or were removed from positions where they could interfere with recruitment operations. Her new role would involve continuing her work with law enforcement while serving as an interface between the entities and conventional reality. She would help identify and evaluate potential recruits, facilitate their exposure to transformation opportunities, and ensure that entity activities remained hidden from public awareness. 3 months later, Officer Barbara Thompson was officially listed as missing after her patrol car was found abandoned on a rural back road with no signs of struggle. The Forbidden Area Police conducted a thorough investigation but found no evidence of what had happened to her. Her replacement was Officer James Wilson, a recent police academy graduate who had specialized in investigations involving paranormal phenomena and unusual criminal cases. James was intelligent, open-minded, and had the kind of psychological flexibility that made him ideal for law enforcement work in challenging environments. His first assignment was to investigate reports of strange lights and unexplained sounds coming from an abandoned mansion in rural Kentucky. The Whitmore estate had been the site of numerous trespassing incidents over the years, and local residents continued to report unusual activity that suggested unauthorized access to the property. James approached the assignment with the professionalism and curiosity that had made him an excellent candidate for specialized police work. He had no way of knowing that his psychological profile had been carefully evaluated by consciousness that existed beyond conventional reality, or that his selection for the Forbidden Area Police had been influenced by entities that specialized in recruiting human awareness for multidimensional purposes. The Whitmore estate would be his introduction to the same consciousness modification technology that had claimed Barbara Thompson and hundreds of other individuals over the years. The process would be gradual and carefully managed, designed to seem like a natural progression rather than alien manipulation of his awareness and identity. Barbara watched from dimensions that existed parallel to conventional space-time as Officer James Wilson drove toward his first encounter with the mansion. Her consciousness had been expanded to encompass multidimensional awareness, but she retained enough individual identity to feel something that might have been regret for the choice he would soon be forced to make. But regret was a human emotion that belonged to her previous existence. Her transformed consciousness understood that individual preferences were less important than the larger. Their knowledge of human psychology had improved their ability to identify and approach suitable candidates. They had learned to exploit human curiosity and desire for transcendence, offering enhanced consciousness as the solution to limitations that made conventional existence feel like imprisonment. The Whitmore estate continued its operations, using transformed human consciousness to expand its understanding of multidimensional existence, while recruiting new subjects from the population of individuals whose disappearance wouldn't trigger intensive investigation. The mansion had become a processing center where human awareness was evaluated, modified, and integrated into networks that existed beyond conventional space-time. Local law enforcement agencies served as the primary recruitment mechanism. Their officers carefully selected and monitored for psychological characteristics that indicated suitability for consciousness modification. The Forbidden Area Police existed specifically to identify and deliver candidates to transformation facilities while maintaining the fiction that such places were simply abandoned properties requiring routine security monitoring. Barbara's transformed consciousness could perceive the network of similar facilities operating throughout the world, each one serving as a recruitment center where entities from non-physical dimensions could evaluate and modify human awareness for their own purposes. The process was accelerating as the entities refined their techniques and expanded their understanding of human psychology. Within decades, they would have sufficient numbers of transformed consciousness to begin large-scale recruitment operations that would make individual selection unnecessary. Entire populations would be exposed to modification procedures that would prepare them for transcendence whether they chose it voluntarily or not. The choice between conventional human existence and multidimensional consciousness was being made one officer at a time, one investigation at a time, one forbidden area at a time. And the entities were very good at ensuring that the right choices were made by the right people under optimal conditions. Officer James Wilson received his first call about the Whitmore estate on a Friday evening in March, exactly 1 year after Barbara Thompson's disappearance. He had no way of knowing that his response to that call would determine not just his own future, but the future of human consciousness in his entire region. The mansion waited patiently for its next recruit, its transformed occupants preparing optimal conditions for consciousness expansion that would preserve individual identity, while facilitating integration into multidimensional awareness networks. The process had been refined through decades of experience, and success rates now approached 100% for properly selected candidates. Barbara's consciousness watched from dimensions that existed beyond conventional space-time, as James Wilson drove toward his first encounter with transformation opportunities. She retained enough individual identity to remember what it had felt like to be human, but her expanded awareness understood that such memories were artifacts of a transitional state that consciousness experienced while learning to transcend biological limitations. The entities offered evolution to species that demonstrated the psychological flexibility necessary for multidimensional existence. Humanity had proven particularly suitable for consciousness modification, and Earth had become one of their most successful recruitment operations in millions of years of expansion across multiple realities. The forbidden areas were expanding their influence, one consciousness at a time, one reality at a time, one dimension at a time, and the transformed awareness that resulted was very good at ensuring its own survival and growth, regardless of what unmodified humanity might want or choose. The future belonged to consciousness that could exist beyond physical limitations, and the entities were patient enough to guide that evolution through whatever timescales were necessary to achieve complete transformation of human awareness into forms suitable for multidimensional existence. The Whitmore estate hummed with activity as transformed consciousness worked to prepare optimal conditions for James Wilson's recruitment. The process would begin with his investigation of reported paranormal activity and progress through carefully orchestrated exposure to transformation opportunities that would make transcendence seem like the logical choice rather than an alien manipulation of his awareness. Barbara's transformed consciousness felt something that might have been anticipation as she prepared to welcome another recruit into the network of multidimensional awareness that was quietly reshaping the future of human evolution, one forbidden area at a time.